Hi everyone. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. Now relax and enjoy the stories. "11 years ago, when I was just 17, we went to visit some relatives out of state for Thanksgiving. At that time, I was constantly dyeing my hair, experimenting with different shades for about a year and a half. Some of the colors were pretty out there, while others were more subdued. My Meemaw would always complain, saying I was damaging my hair and making it brittle, the usual warnings you'd expect. I know she was only saying it out of love, not trying to be mean, but I would just roll my eyes and tell her, "Okay, Meemaw, I'll be more careful," then change the subject. So we had a nice dinner, fell into food comas, and after a few hours in front of the TV, I decided to head to bed. But before I went to sleep, I figured I should take a shower to wash my hair. After helping my Meemaw cook, I was sure there was a gallon of grease in it. With the house completely quiet, I stepped into the bathroom to shower. At first, it was just pure bliss. Nothing like a hot shower after a long day. I then browsed through Meemaw's collection of shampoos, picked one, and started washing my hair. At some point, when I ran my fingers through my hair, I noticed some resistance. Not entirely unusual, as my hair had always tangled easily, but a hard tug doesn't typically fix that. I cleared the water from my eyes, looked down, and was shocked to see a huge clump of my purple hair between my fingers. At first, I wasn't freaking out, just concerned. But then, as I kept washing my hair, another massive clump came out. That's when I started panicking, tugging at the rest of my hair to see if it was just as brittle or damaged. I can't even begin to describe the horror I felt when it seemed like almost all of my hair just fell out in a matter of minutes. It didn't hurt, but don't let that fool you. The emotional pain was more than enough to make up for the lack of physical. I remember being in my blind panic, stepping out of the shower and looking in the mirror. Apart from a few loose strands, I was completely and utterly bald. I barely recognized myself. I felt actually physically sick, and by the time I felt like my soul had come back to my body, I just let out this long scream. Half my family came bursting into the bathroom in the seconds that followed, each of them shouting a mixed bag of, "What's wrong? What happened? Are you okay? What did you do to your hair?" I just cried for like an hour straight, shaking and wailing, and just totally unable to compute what had happened. It was honestly like a living nightmare, and when I realized it was probably an indication that I was in poor health, I became convinced that I was dying. I was so depressed that my mom had to basically drag me into the shower, force feed me tea hose, then take me down to the doctor's office to get me checked over. We found out what the issue was, and although it wasn't life-threatening, it took me literally months to come out of what was the darkest and most crushing depression of my life. An acute, sudden autoimmune reaction, the doctor said. Pretty much overnight alopecia. Well, not so much overnight. I'd noticed I was losing a bit more hair than usual, but like Meemaw said, the almost constant cycle of bleaching and dyeing had definitely damaged my hair a little. But having it all come out in almost one fell swoop was crushing. I lost almost all my body hair too, which wasn't nearly as rough as the hair on my head, but I still felt like a total freak in the months following Thanksgiving. As horrible as this all sounds, I'd like to reassure everyone that there's definitely been something of a happy ending, or rather that there's some serious silver lining in my condition. Good wigs are expensive, sure, but I can now have a different hair color for each day of the week, all without the lengthy dyeing process. I also save a ton of time and hassle in shaving my legs, among other things, and as much as the whole losing my hair thing sucked, I basically looked at it like nature's laser hair removal. The point being, our bodies can scare the life out of us, but whatever you're going through, this too shall pass. You just gotta be strong and find those silver linings. In my 20s, I worked as an overnight lead at a small retail store. It wasn't part of a big chain, it was a local business with only 8 or 9 locations, so the atmosphere was a lot quieter than most larger stores. On most nights, I had an overnight stalker to assist, but it wasn't unusual for me to be alone for the entire shift. The store wasn't large and the pace wasn't hectic, so I often found myself moving slower just to keep myself busy. This particular night was one of those where I was alone, taking my time as I stocked the shelves. At the start of my shift, I loaded up some boxes and began moving through the aisles. The work didn't require much focus, so my mind wandered, thinking about random things, not really paying attention to anything. I worked through 3 aisles without incident until a knock on the front door startled me. I almost didn't register what it was at first, but once I did, confusion set in. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and peeked through the large front windows. I saw a man in a hood standing outside. I walked over to the other side of the door and spoke through the glass. "We're closed. Won't open until 8 a.m. The man looked at me but didn't respond. I pointed to the sign on the door, repeating, "We're closed." "Sorry." He stared at me for a few more seconds before turning around and walking off. I watched him until he disappeared from view, but I noticed he hadn't parked anywhere. It all seemed strange, but I figured he was just confused or at the wrong place. I went back to my work, stocking the shelves, and eventually pushed the encounter out of my mind. By 2 a.m., I had made it halfway through the aisles and decided it was time for a lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and headed to the break room on the other side of the building. I spent about half an hour there before I threw out the rest of my lunch and went back to work. As I walked back through the store and reached the aisle I was working on, something caught my eye. A man was walking across the store, headed in the opposite direction. He didn't seem to notice me. I froze in place, the instant wave of fear rushing over me. Now listening intently, I could hear the man's footsteps move toward the side of the building I'd just come from. So I moved into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they went toward the break room, but just before I left the aisle to try and run and get help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. The footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I ran for the other end of the aisle, looking back and seeing the man turn in and start running at me. I ran for the front door, getting my keys out and trying to unlock it with shaky hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I got it open. And just as I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash in the corner of my eye and heard a pop sound that made my ears ring. A gunshot, so loud, I didn't even know where it landed. But I sprinted for my life around the building. I made it to my car and hid in the back seat as I called 911. From what I know, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time police made it to the store, but they found the back door to be busted open, along with some heavy tools sitting next to it. The most terrifying of their findings was the hole created by the gunshot, sitting right to the side of the front doors. Why the man broke in and was so aggressive targeting me like that is unknown. From his behavior, the police seemed to think it was some kind of mental breakdown or psychotic break, not having any real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but I can tell you that for the years following that incident, I was on edge every single night. I work as a mechanic at a car shop in my town. It's a locally owned repair shop that's been around for many years. The shop operates out of an old warehouse and has a bunch of broken down cars and car parts scattered around outside, which we refer to as the scrapyard. The scrapyard mainly holds cars waiting for parts, but the name just stuck. For the past 2 years, my main responsibility has been ordering and keeping track of stock. The best time to do this is overnight when it's quieter. I also end up doing a bit of security work since it's not uncommon for people, especially teenagers or troublemakers, to jump the fence and mess with or steal things from the scrapyard. On this particular night, I got into work at 8 p.m., talked with my boss for a bit, and then I was left alone in the warehouse. It was raining outside, so the noise of the rain against the building was calming, though a little loud. I went through the orders from the mechanics, checking what parts had been used during the day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but 2 cars needed specific parts. One of them had a mechanic who didn't write down the model year, which could be really important for finding the right part. I got up from my desk and walked through the warehouse to find the gray Nissan Versa, so I could confirm what part was needed. But when I reached the end of the warehouse, I still couldn't spot it. I sighed, knowing it had to be out in the scrapyard, which was a pain since it was raining. I went back to my desk, grabbed a quick coffee, and then suited up with my jacket and flashlight to go check outside. The rain had picked up since I'd last been out. In the distance, I saw the car hiding between a few other vehicles. I stepped out into the rain and started walking toward it, turning on my flashlight. But as I was making my way toward the center of the scrapyard, I stopped dead in my tracks. I'd noticed some movement just at the edge of the light. It looked like someone was moving from behind one of the cars. The rain muffled any sounds, so I just stood still, holding my flashlight up, waiting for more movement. "Hello? I saw you already. Just get out of here," I called out, hoping it was just a kid messing around. I took a few steps closer to where I saw the movement and called again for whoever it was to leave. I didn't see anything, so I started scanning the area, but whoever had been there must have already left. Honestly, I felt a bit of relief that I didn't have to call the cops or do anything drastic. I quickly walked over to the Nissan, confirmed the model year, and then jogged back to the warehouse. Once inside, I took off my jacket, sat back at my desk, and finished filling out the order. I spent the next half hour or so processing more orders, then had to do some stock counting in the actual warehouse part of the building. By that time, it was probably 12:30 or 1 a.m. I walked along the shelves, checking which everyday products and parts had been used up. While making my way down the first set of shelves, a sudden thud rang through the warehouse and then the lights went out. I stood with my eyes wide open, staring into the abyss of dark. I couldn't see anything, but between the sound of the rain hitting the roof, I could hear footsteps walking through the building. I stared in the direction of where the sound was coming from and could immediately tell that they were coming toward me. I didn't know what to do. At this point, I was sure that whoever was in here had shut off the power. But why they were here, I didn't know. And without any light, I couldn't even run away. All I could do was listen to their footsteps grow louder as I stared into the pitch black, hoping they didn't know where I was. They were only about 10 feet away when I heard them stop. After a moment, I heard a box open and things being shifted around before the footsteps began going away. I was holding my breath the whole time, and after 30 seconds, it was completely silent. I waited for a few minutes before finally taking my phone out and calling 911, then using the flashlight on it to move toward the breaker room and flipping the power switch back on. Looking through the warehouse with the police, all that was left were the wet shoe prints going through the building and out the back door. It seemed like the person that was out in the scrapyard had probably slipped in while I was outside and the door was still unlocked. Then they obviously stole a bunch of gear from our warehouse. Even though they likely didn't have the intent to hurt me, who knows what could have happened if they knew I was standing only a few feet from them. And without me ever getting a look at them, there's a chance that they came fully armed and willing to do anything. The bass thumped so loudly that I could feel it deep in my bones, but it couldn't drown out the voice in my head, screaming that something was terribly wrong. I never imagined a music festival could turn into a nightmare. But then again, I never thought I'd be fighting for my life in a sea of oblivious partygoers. It was supposed to be the ultimate weekend, Euphoria Music Festival, 3 days of non-stop music, dancing, and freedom under the California desert sun. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, saving up for tickets, coordinating outfits, and dreaming about the memories we'd create. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. The energy was electric, the music vibrating through the air as thousands of us danced beneath the scorching sun. As night fell, the desert morphed into a magical landscape, illuminated by glowing art installations and stages pumping out beats that made the very ground tremble. It was during the headline act of the second night that things began to unravel. We were right in the middle of the crowd, jumping and singing along, when I realized I couldn't see any of my friends. At first, I wasn't concerned. We'd gotten separated before, and we always found each other eventually. But when the set ended and the crowd began to disperse, they were still nowhere to be found. I made my way to our designated meeting point, a giant neon sculpture of a hand reaching towards the sky. But they weren't there either. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I tried calling them, but the cell service was practically non-existent, swamped by thousands of people trying to use their phones all at once. After what felt like hours of searching, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and starting to panic. That's when I ran into Sarah. She seemed to materialize out of nowhere, a friendly face amidst the crowd of strangers. "You look lost," she said, her voice managing to rise above the festival noise. "Need some help?" she asked. I quickly explained my situation, relief flooding through me at the thought of finally getting help. Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I know a place where we can get a better view," she said. "Maybe we'll spot your friends from there." I followed her without a second thought, grateful for her kindness. We weaved through the crowd, moving away from the main stages and towards the outer edges of the festival grounds. As we walked, Sarah chatted casually about the bands she'd seen and how much fun she was having. It wasn't until we'd been walking for about 15 minutes that I realized how far we had strayed from the center of the festival. The music had faded to a distant thump, and the crowds had thinned to nearly nothing. Unease crept back into my mind. "Sarah," I said, slowing my pace, "I think we should head back. This doesn't seem like a good place to look for my friends." Sarah turned to me, and the change in her expression made my blood run cold. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by something calculating and cold. "Oh, we're not looking for your friends," she said. "We're meeting mine." Before I could react, two men stepped out from behind a nearby structure. They were large and intimidating, with hard eyes that regarded me like a piece of meat. I turned to run, but Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't make this difficult," she hissed. "You're coming with us, one way or another." My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Human trafficking? Robbery? Whatever it was, I knew I was in serious danger. I opened my mouth to scream, but one of the men clamped his hand over it, muffling my cries. They started dragging me towards a van parked in the shadows. I fought with everything I had, kicking and thrashing, but they were too strong. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I realized how easily I'd fallen into their trap. Just as they were about to shove me into the van, a voice rang out. "Hey, what's going on over there?" It was a security guard, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. My captors hesitated for a split second, and that was all I needed. I bit down hard on the hand covering my mouth, tasting blood. The man yelped and loosened his grip. I wrenched myself free and ran towards the security guard, screaming for help. The guard radioed for backup as Sarah and her accomplices fled into the night. I collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably, as the reality of what had almost happened sank in. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police were called, statements were taken, and my friends were finally located. They had been searching for me too, frantic with worry. When they heard what had happened, they were horrified and guilt-ridden for losing track of me. The festival organizers were apologetic and supportive, offering counseling and upgrading our accommodations for the rest of the weekend. But the magic of the event was gone for me. Every face in the crowd now seemed potentially sinister. Every friendly stranger a possible threat. We stayed for the final day, mostly because changing our travel plans would have been a logistical nightmare. But I couldn't enjoy it. The music that had lifted my spirits now grated on my nerves. The carefree atmosphere felt false, a thin veneer hiding darker realities. As we drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to disappearing, how easily I'd trusted Sarah, how quickly things had spiraled out of control. The festival that was supposed to be a celebration of life and music had become a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in the world. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with anxiety and paranoia. Crowds made me nervous, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends tried to understand, but they hadn't experienced the bone-deep terror of being powerless in the hands of people who meant them harm. Therapy helped slowly. I learned coping mechanisms and worked on rebuilding my sense of safety. But I also learned valuable lessons about situational awareness and trusting my instincts. I didn't swear off music festivals entirely. The thought of letting fear rob me of experiences I loved was almost as scary as what had happened. but I approach them differently now. No more separating from the group. No more trusting strangers no matter how friendly they seemed. Took time, but eventually, I found a balance between caution and enjoyment. I could appreciate the music and the atmosphere while staying vigilant. I made sure my friends and I had a solid buddy system and check-in procedures. We researched festivals thoroughly, choosing ones with strong security measures and good reputations. The experience changed me. There's no doubt about that. But it also taught me resilience. I learned that I was stronger than I knew, that I could face my fears and come out the other side. A year after the incident, I returned to Euphoria. It was a decision I struggled with, but ultimately, I felt it was important for my healing process. Walking through those gates again was one of the toughest things I've ever done. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I thought about turning around and leaving. But then the music began, and something inside me shifted. I looked around at the smiling faces, the elaborate costumes, and the art installations glowing in the fading light. And in that moment, I realized that while there is darkness in the world, there is also light. There is joy, connection, and the transformative power of music. I danced that night, surrounded by my friends, more alive and present than I had felt in months. The bass pulsed through me, but this time it didn't drown out my thoughts. It amplified them. I was here. I was safe. I was strong. As the headliner took the stage and the crowd erupted into cheers, I felt tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of fear or sadness, but of release and triumph. I had faced my demons and come out dancing. The festival experience will never be the same for me. I'll always be a bit more cautious, a little more aware, but I refuse to let fear control my life. Instead, I choose to live it fully, to dance harder, love deeper, and never take for granted the gift of being fully present in a moment of pure joy. Because in the end, that's what music festivals are really about. Not just the beats and the bands, but the reminder that even in a world that can be dark and dangerous, there are moments of pure magic. And those moments are worth fighting for. The neon sign flickered ominously as we pulled into the diner's parking lot, casting a sickly red glow over the rain-soaked asphalt. Lou's Pit Stop, it read, though the S&T in stop had long since burned out. I glanced at my best friend, Sarah, and saw my own unease mirrored in her eyes. We hadn't planned on stopping here, but after hours of driving through the night, we were both beyond tired and desperately needed coffee. It's just a quick stop, I said, trying to sound more assured than I felt. We'll be back on the road in no time. Sarah nodded, but I could tell she was just as uneasy as I was. There was something about this place that felt off, something that sent a chill down my spine. But it was the only sign of civilization we'd seen for miles, and with our gas tank running dangerously low, we didn't have much choice. The bell above the door jingled as we stepped inside, drawing the attention of the few patrons scattered around the dim diner. An older man at the counter glanced up at us, narrowing his eyes before returning to his coffee. A group of men in the corner booth fell silent, their conversation halting abruptly as they took in our presence. I suddenly became acutely aware of how out of place we must have seemed. Two young women who clearly didn't belong here, our clothes wrinkled and tired from the long drive. I self-consciously tugged at the hem of my shirt as we made our way to an empty booth in the back. The vinyl seats were cracked, the table sticky with what I hoped was just spilled syrup. A weary-looking waitress appeared almost immediately, her pen ready on a well-worn notepad. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice rough from years of cigarettes. "Just coffee, please," I said. "For both of us." She nodded and shuffled off, leaving Sarah and me to absorb our surroundings. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with faded photographs on the walls and an ancient jukebox in the corner that had probably been silent for decades. "I don't like this place," Sarah whispered, leaning in. "Something feels wrong." I was about to agree when the waitress returned with our coffee. As she set the mugs down, I noticed a dark bruise on her wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve. She saw me looking and quickly pulled her arm back, avoiding eye contact. "You girls just passing through?" she asked. Her tone casual, but her eyes darting nervously to the group in the corner. "Yeah. We're on our way too," I started to say, but Sarah kicked me under the table. I realized my mistake too late. Probably wasn't wise to tell strangers our destination. "We're just taking a road trip," Sarah finished smoothly. "I no real destination in mind." The waitress nodded, a flicker of something, relief, concern, passing across her face. "Well, you be careful out there. These roads can be dangerous at night." As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words held more meaning than a simple warning about driving conditions. We sipped our coffee in silence, both of us on edge. That's when I started to notice the conversations around us. First, it was just snippets, words that didn't quite make sense out of context. But as I listened more closely, a chill ran down my spine. The men in the corner were talking in low, urgent tones. I caught phrases like shipment coming in and need to move it fast. One of them mentioned a new girl, and they all laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. I looked at Sarah, and I could tell from her expression that she'd heard it too. We needed to leave now, but as I reached for my wallet to pay for the coffee, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find my car keys. I distinctly remembered putting them in my pocket when we entered the diner, but now they were gone. "Sarah," I whispered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I can't find my keys." Her eyes widened. "What? Are you sure?" I nodded, my heart racing. "They must have fallen out somewhere. Help me look." We searched as discreetly as we could, checking under the table and in the cracks of the booth seats, but the keys were nowhere to be found. The bell above the door jingled again, and I looked up to see a police officer enter the diner. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Surely he could help us. But then I saw the way the men in the corner greeted him, the familiar nods and smiles. My blood ran cold as I realized he was probably in on whatever was happening here. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Sarah. "Now," she nodded, her face pale. We stood up, trying to act casual as we made our way to the door. But before we could reach it, one of the men from the corner booth stepped into our path. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Why don't you stay a while? We don't get many visitors around here." I could feel the eyes of everyone in the diner on us. The waitress stood behind the counter, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. The police officer watched with detached interest, making no move to intervene. "We really need to get going," Sarah said, her voice steadier than I expected. "Thanks for the coffee." We tried to step around him, but he moved to block us again. Now, he said, his tone turning menacing. "That's not very friendly. We're just trying to be hospitable." I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see another man from the group standing behind us. We were trapped. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw the glint of metal as one of the men reached into his jacket. The waitress turned away, unable to watch. The police officer stood up, his hand moving to his holster. But then, something unexpected happened. The older man from the counter, the one who had eyed us suspiciously when we first entered, suddenly spoke up. "Let them go, Frank," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the diner freeze. "They're not worth the trouble." The man blocking our path, Frank, hesitated, looking uncertainly between us and the older man. "But Dad," he started to say. I said, "Let them go," the older man repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "We've got bigger things to worry about tonight." For a tense moment, I thought Frank might argue, but then he stepped aside, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "You heard him," he growled. "Get out, and don't even think about coming back this way." We didn't need a second warning. Sarah and I dashed for the door, not stopping until we were safely inside the car. By some stroke of luck, the keys were sitting on the driver's seat, clearly visible through the window. Had they been there the whole time, or had someone placed them there while we were inside? My hands trembled as I unlocked the car, and we jumped in. As I started the engine, I saw the group of men step out of the diner, watching us. The older man stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. I threw the car into reverse and slammed the gas pedal, peeling out of the parking lot. My heart was pounding in my ears as I drove. We didn't speak a word, both of us too rattled to process what had just happened. Finally, after several miles, with the diner long gone behind us, Sarah turned to me. What just happened back there? I shook my head, still trying to make sense of it all. I don't know, but I think we just narrowly escaped something terrible. We drove through the night, not stopping again until we reached the next major town. When we checked into a motel, both of us too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion, I couldn't shake the memory of that diner. The suspicious glances, the hushed conversations, the fear in the waitress's eyes. I never reported what happened that night. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what exactly would we say? But to this day, whenever I pass a lonely diner on a dark stretch of road, I keep driving. Some stops, I've learned, are better left unmade. The sharp, burnt rubber scent hit me hard as smoke poured from beneath the hood of my car. I slowly rolled to a stop at the side of the empty rural road, feeling a wave of dread as the engine coughed its final breath. The sky was ablaze with colors from the setting sun, its fiery oranges and reds lighting up the horizon, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I was alone, miles from civilization, and completely out of reach of any cell service. I lifted the hood, hoping to find something small I could fix myself. A rush of steam escaped, and I peered into the tangle of wires and pipes under the hood. It was clear this was beyond my ability to fix. I'm no mechanic, and without any tools, I was useless. I slammed the hood shut in frustration and leaned back against the car, taking in my bleak surroundings. Wide fields stretched endlessly around me, their golden wheat gently swaying with the breeze of the evening. In the distance, I could just make out a farmhouse with a dim light flickering in one of its windows. It was my best chance for help. But before I could decide whether to walk toward it or wait for a car to pass, I heard the hum of an engine drawing nearer. I turned, relief flooding me as an old pickup truck slowed down beside me. The driver, a man probably in his 40s with a weathered face and warm eyes, lowered his window. Car trouble. His voice was rough but kind. I nodded, relieved at the sight of him. Yeah, it just died on me. Do you know anything about engines? He chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm afraid not, miss, but I can give you a ride into town. There's a mechanic there who can probably help. I paused. Every instinct told me not to get into a car with a stranger, especially out here, where no one would hear a thing. But as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I realized I didn't have much of a choice. That would be great. Thank you, I said, doing my best to keep the nervousness out of my voice. He gave me a reassuring smile, then reached over to open the passenger door. Hop in. Name's Earl, by the way. Sarah, I replied, climbing into the truck. The inside smelled of tobacco and pine air freshener, an odd but not unpleasant mix. Earl shifted the truck into gear, and we started driving. I kept my hand near the door handle, ready to bolt if I had to. But Earl's steady chatter soon began to ease my nerves. He told me about his farm, his grandkids visiting soon, and the time his own truck had broken down miles from anywhere, forcing him to walk all night just to get home. His stories made me smile, even laugh at some of his cheesy jokes. But as we continued down the road, something felt off. We'd been driving for more than half an hour, and there were no signs of any town. The fields had given way to dense woods, the road twisting and narrowing. Earl, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, are you sure this is the way to town? He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. Oh, don't you worry. We're taking a bit of a shortcut. It'll get us there quicker. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I remembered all those true crime podcasts I'd listened to. All those stories of women who got into cars with seemingly friendly strangers and were never seen again. Actually, I said, my mouth dry. I think I'd prefer to go back to my car. I can wait there for a tow truck. Earl's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. Now, he said, his voice losing its friendly tone. Don't go getting all worked up. We're almost there. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out even though we were moving at a dangerous speed. Just as my fingers closed around the handle, Earl slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, and I was thrown forward, my seat belt cutting into my chest. Before I could react, Earl had reached across me and locked the door. I'm sorry about this, he said, his voice oddly calm, but I can't let you leave, not yet. Panic overwhelmed me, emmed me. I clawed at the door, trying desperately to unlock it, but Earl grabbed my wrists, his grip like iron. Stop fighting, he growled. You'll only make it worse for yourself. I screamed, hoping against hope that someone would hear me. But we were miles from anywhere, surrounded by nothing but dark, silent forest. Earl started the truck again, driving deeper into the woods. I sat frozen in terror, my mind racing with all the horrible possibilities of what might happen to me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we pulled up to a small cabin. The headlights illuminated a decrepit porch, the wood rotting and the paint peeling. Earl got out, coming around to my side of the truck. He opened the door, grabbing my arm and pulling me out. I tried to resist, but he was much stronger than me. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. Please don't do this. Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear. He ignored my pleas, dragging me towards the cabin. As we got closer, I heard something that made my blood run cold, voices coming from inside. There was more than one person waiting for us. Earl pushed open the door, shoving me inside. I stumbled, falling to my knees on the dusty floor. As I looked up, my eyes widening in shock and confusion, I saw something I never expected. The cabin was filled with people, men, women, even a few children. They were huddled together, looking as terrified as I felt. And standing in the center of the room was a man I recognized instantly from news reports. The leader of a doomsday cult that had disappeared months ago. Welcome, the cult leader said, his voice soft but menacing. We've been waiting for you. Earl stepped forward, standing next to the cult leader. I brought another one, just like you asked. I looked around the room, my mind struggling to process what was happening. These people weren't Earl's accomplices. They were his victims, just like me. The cult leader began to speak, spouting nonsense about the end of the world, and how we were the chosen ones who would survive. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were darting around the room, looking for any chance of escape. That's when I saw it. A small window near the back of the cabin. It was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, but it looked big enough for a person to fit through. As the cult leader droned on, I slowly inched my way towards the window. The other captives watched me, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. I reached the window, my fingers fumbling with the latch. It was rusted shut, refusing to budge. I glanced back at the cult leader and Earl, but they were engrossed in their mad ramblings, paying no attention to me. With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to force the window open. The sound of creaking would fill the cabin and everyone froze. Stop her, the cult leader yelled, but it was too late. I was already halfway out the window when I heard the rapid pounding of footsteps behind me. I hit the ground, tumbling out of the truck, and scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. Without thinking, I ran blindly into the dense, dark forest. Branches scraped against my face, and unseen roots sent me stumbling, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear shouting and the sound of someone chasing me, getting closer, but I kept pushing forward. My lungs screamed, and my legs were on fire, but the fear of what might be behind me kept me moving. How long I ran, I have no idea. Minutes? Hours? But eventually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, and the forest's night noises took their place. I slowed down, gasping for air, my body trembling. I had no clue where I was, or which way led back to safety, but stopping wasn't an option. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I heard something that made my heart leap with relief, the distant hum of traffic. I stumbled toward it, following the sound until I finally broke through the trees onto the highway. A trucker saw me and immediately stopped, calling the police. Sitting in the truck's cab, waiting for help, the gravity of everything that had happened started to sink in. I broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the nightmare I had barely escaped. In the days that followed, as I gave my statements to the police and tried to process the trauma, I learned the full extent of Earl's deception. He had been working with a cult, luring stranded motorists for months. The police raided the cabin, freeing other captives and arresting Earl along with the cult leader. I was fortunate to have gotten away, but the experience forever changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of the dangers that can hide behind friendly faces. It also revealed a strength I hadn't known I had, a strength that kept me alive when I needed it most. Now, whenever I see someone stranded by the side of the road, I feel torn between wanting to help and remembering that terrifying night. I usually end up calling the police or a tow truck, not able to just drive past without doing something, but never again willing to put myself at risk. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous person you meet is the one who offers to help. The moment I stepped onto the porch of that isolated farmhouse, I knew something was terribly wrong. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and an eerie silence blanketed the property. As a social worker, I'd encountered my share of troubled homes, but nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that awaited inside. My name is Claire, and I've been a social worker for nearly a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Homes ravaged by poverty, families torn apart by addiction, children with scars both visible and hidden. But the Lawson case, that was different. That was the case that almost broke me. Started like any other day. I received a report about the Lawson family, concerns over neglect, possible domestic violence. The usual protocol was to do a home visit, assess the situation, and determine if further intervention was necessary. The file mentioned that the family lived in a remote area, but I didn't realize just how isolated they were until I found myself driving down a narrow dirt road, fields of dying corn stretching endlessly on either side. The farmhouse appeared abruptly, looming against the gray sky like something out of a Gothic novel. Paint peeled from its weathered boards, and several windows were boarded up. As I parked my car, I noticed there were no other vehicles in sight. Strange. The file listed 2 parents and 3 children, so I gathered my bag and clipboard, took a deep breath, and approached the front door. That's when I noticed the first sign something was off. The door wasn't just unlocked. It was partially open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Smears of what looked disturbingly like blood stained the white paint. "Hello," I called out, my voice small and uncertain in the thick silence. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, this is Claire from Social Services. I'm here for our scheduled visit." No response. Not even the sound of movement from within the house. Just that unnerving silence. Every instinct told me to turn around, to call the police and let them handle whatever was going on here. But I couldn't shake the thought of the 3 children mentioned in the file. What if they were in there hurt or scared? I had a duty to make sure they were safe. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with the musty smell of neglect and something else, something coppery and sickening that made my stomach turn. "Hello," I called again, fumbling for the light switch. Clicked, but nothing happened. The power was out. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The living room was a scene of chaos. Furniture overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor. And there, on the faded floral wallpaper, were more of those dark rust-colored smears. My heart pounding, I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was equally disturbed, drawers pulled out and their contents scattered across the linoleum. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, covered in a fine layer of mold. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been recent. As I turned to check the rest of the house, something caught my eye. A child's drawing was pinned to the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a smiling sun. The crayon sketch showed this house with 5 stick figures standing in front. But 3 of the figures had been violently scribbled out with black crayon, leaving only 2 standing. A chill ran down my spine. What had happened to this family? I made my way upstairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The upper floor was a long hallway with several doors leading off it. The first room I checked appeared to be the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, clothes strewn about as if someone had left in a hurry. But it was the message scrawled on the mirror in what looked horribly like lipstick that made my breath catch. They're coming for us. The next room was clearly a child's. Pink wallpaper, stuffed animals piled on the bed. But here too, signs of violence marred the innocent space. Deep gouges scored the walls, and a family photo on the nightstand had been smashed, glass shards glittering in the beam of my flashlight. As I backed out of the room, a sound from downstairs made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the kitchen floor. My heart leapt into my throat. I wasn't alone in the house. I tried to calm my breathing, to think rationally. It could be one of the Lawsons returned home to find a stranger in their house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever was down there, it wasn't the family I'd come to check on. I crept towards the stairs, straining my ears for any further sound. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A low, guttural sound, almost like an animal growling. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness below. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a shape moved in the shadows at the bottom of the staircase. A figure, hunched and misshapen, its movements jerky and unnatural. Terror seized me. This was no person, no animal I'd ever seen. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper. I'm not sure. But suddenly, the thing's head snapped up, and I found myself staring into eyes that glowed an unnatural, sickly yellow in the darkness. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, down the hallway towards what I prayed was another staircase, another way out. Behind me, I could hear it coming, its movements faster now, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that made my skin crawl. I found the back stairs and practically flew down them, my feet barely touching the steps. I burst out the back door into the fading daylight, not daring to look back as I sprinted towards my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rear-view mirror, something emerging from the house, its form seeming to shift and change as it moved. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind me as I accelerated down the dirt road. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over, I called the police with trembling hands. I told them about the signs of struggle, the disturbing messages, the overwhelming feeling that something terrible had happened in that house. But I couldn't bring myself to mention what I'd seen inside. Who would believe me? The police investigation turned up nothing. No bodies, no evidence of foul play. The Lawson family had simply vanished, leaving behind a house full of unanswered questions. The case went cold, filed away as just another mysterious disappearance. But I knew the truth. I knew that something inhuman had been in that house, something likely responsible for whatever fate had befallen the Lawsons. And sometimes, late at night, I still see those glowing yellow eyes in my dreams, still hear that unearthly keening sound. I left social work soon after. I couldn't bear the thought of walking into another house like that, of encountering whatever nightmare had taken up residence in that isolated farmhouse. Some days, I almost convinced myself it was all a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. But then, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, or hear a sound that's not quite natural. And I'll remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the dark corners of abandoned homes, waiting for unsuspecting visitors. And I'll say a silent prayer for the Lawson family, hoping that whatever fate befell them was quick, because the alternative, that they might still be out there in the clutches of that unnatural thing, is too horrifying to contemplate. So, I keep my doors locked, my lights on, and I never ever venture into isolated farmhouses anymore. Because once you've seen behind the veil, once you've glimpsed the horrors that lurk just out of sight, you can never truly feel safe again. For many years, Robert Wilson, a 53-year-old man, worked as a night shift security officer at the pharmaceutical company Thornton Ross in Huddersfield, UK. He was good at his job, overseeing the site's security with impressive diligence. During his time at Thornton Ross, there had never been a break-in or any incidents of vandalism, and he was well on his way to being promoted to head of security. Robert had endured a lot of misfortune in his life and had to change careers several times. But for the first time in a long while, things were finally going well for him. It seemed like his luck was starting to turn around. However, one chance encounter with two teenage boys at the beginning of 2020 would change everything for him. On the night of January 16, 2020, around 11 p.m., Robert was monitoring the CCTV feeds in the security office when he noticed two shadowy figures walking around the parking lot. He immediately gathered his colleague, John Badejo, and another officer, and the three of them set out to investigate. When they reached the parking lot, they discovered that the figures were just two young boys, 16-year-old Luke Goffroger and 19-year-old Kieran Earnshaw, and that they appeared to be quite drunk. When confronted, the boys seemed apologetic, claiming they had only been trying to take a shortcut through the facility, but one of them had dropped his phone in the process. As a kind-hearted man, Robert offered to help the boys find the missing phone. He also thought that if he could help them quickly, they would leave and he could get back to his duties. Robert took out his phone and switched on the flashlight to help search the dark parking lot. However, while doing so, he accidentally shone the light in Kieran's direction. In his drunken state, Kieran mistook this as Robert recording him and angrily demanded that Robert turn off the phone. Robert, confused, explained that he was only using the flashlight, but Kieran didn't believe him. The situation escalated, and harsh words were exchanged between the two. But things took a dangerous turn when Kieran reached into his tracksuit pants and pulled out a sword. The sword, which was originally meant to be a decorative ornament, had been sharpened and had grip tape applied to the handle, turning it from a harmless accessory into a lethal weapon. Without warning, Kieran attacked Robert, slashing and striking him with the sword. Robert instinctively raised his right hand to defend himself, but the blow was so powerful that it severed 4 of his fingers at once. John Badejo, witnessing the horror, rushed to his colleague's aid as Robert's severed fingers fell to the ground. The brutal attack left Robert bleeding and helpless, and the situation quickly spiraled into chaos. But Kieran was quick and saw John's approach out of the corner of his eye. He turned, swinging the sword hard in his direction, slicing through the thick fabric of his jacket and sending sharpened steel plunging into his flesh. John Badejo backed off, clenching at the fresh wound while Kieran turned his attentions back to Robert Wilson, who by that point was attempting to crawl away, mortally wounded. Kieran began hacking away at him again. As Robert's colleagues fled the scene, the blood-curdling scream of their wounded friend echoing around the parking lot as they ran. Kieran's friend, Luke, then joined the attack, pulling out a knife from his jacket and began to stab the fallen Robert over and over again until he screamed no more. CCTV footage had managed to capture every second of the attack from start to finish, and the two teenagers were quickly tracked down and arrested by the West Yorkshire Police. Under advice from their defense attorneys, both plead guilty to Robert's murder. Kieran Earnshaw was sentenced to life. Luke Goffroger was sentenced to a minimum term of 16 years 17 days. Kieran also pleaded guilty to inflicting serious bodily harm on the second victim, John Badejo, and Luke pleaded guilty to the possession of an offensive weapon. James Goddard of Britain's Crown Prosecution Service said that this was a ferocious and frenzied attack on an innocent man who was simply carrying out his duties. The two teenagers inflicted a horrific level of violence on Mr. Wilson, as well as seriously injuring Mr. Badejo. The two defendants are now facing significant jail sentences. Our thoughts remain with Mr. Wilson's family and friends as they have been throughout. When questioned by investigating police, Kieran Earnshaw was apparently unable to provide any legitimate reason as to why he was carrying a sword. He claimed it was for self-defense. But when pressed on who he was seeking to defend himself from, he had no response except to shrug. The only conclusion that we can draw is that Kieran was carrying that sword because he wished to use it on another human being, and he was not particularly fussy on who that might be. There's every chance that Kieran knew that Robert Wilson wasn't recording him that night, and that he simply chose to feign outrage so that he had an excuse to take out that sword and end a man's life. Kieran had been out drinking that day for hours on end and was apparently carrying that sword with him the whole time. But he opted to use it at night, possibly because it was the only time he was drunk enough to do so. Yet is there not something about the dark of the night that brings out the most predatory and violent side of a man? So the point remains, if Robert Wilson had been working the day shift, if he had been safely inside his own home when the sun had gone down, he might still be alive today. I live with my parents here in Escambia County, Florida. One evening, my mom and I were relaxing and watching TV when we suddenly heard loud shouting from outside. Initially, my mom just shrugged it off, making a remark about the neighbors being as noisy as usual, and we kept watching the show. But the yelling grew louder, and we began hearing the sound of an engine revving. My mom turned the volume down, and we both started paying attention to what was happening. It sounded like the shouting was right outside our house. So, I got up and peeked through the curtains of the TV room to see what was going on. Outside, there was a kid standing in the street in nothing but his underwear, facing off with a truck. He was yelling at the driver, who was yelling back. From what I could gather, the truck driver was trying to get the kid to do something, and the kid was refusing. The way the kid spoke made it seem like it was a family dispute. My suspicion was confirmed when the kid called the driver Dad during the exchange. The argument reached a boiling point, with both of them screaming at each other. The driver leaned out of the truck window, revved the engine, and tried to run the kid down in the middle of the street. Fortunately, the kid managed to dodge the truck just in time, running into one of our neighbor's yards as the truck sped past him. My mom, who had also been watching by this point, gasped and said, "Oh my gosh!" We watched as the truck did a U-turn in the street, clearly preparing for another attempt at the kid. But the kid wasn't about to let that happen. He dashed across yards, running toward our house and banging on the front door, screaming for help. We quickly opened the door and let him inside just as the truck rushed by again, with the driver shouting out of the window as it came to a halt. We slammed the door shut, and my mom ran to call the police while I tried to comfort the kid, even though he was just in his underwear, and I wasn't exactly thrilled about hugging a half-naked teenager in the middle of a panic. That's when the kid's dad started banging on our door, shouting about how he knew his son was inside and demanding that he come out to face whatever punishment he had in mind. As the chaos continued, I asked the kid what had sparked such an intense argument, and you wouldn't believe what he said next. He told me, straight up, that no matter how much his dad insisted, he wasn't going to take a bath. He ranted about how he was a grown-up, and he could do whatever he wanted, including not having anyone interfere with his personal hygiene. It's only then that I start to notice just how bad this kid smells, how his breath smelled awful and his skin was greasy looking. He obviously hadn't bathed in quite a while, and although there's obviously no excuses for trying to run someone over for something like that, I started to understand why his dad had gotten so frustrated. Now this whole time, the dad is banging on the door saying he's not going to leave until his son comes out, but my mom had come back to tell us that the cops were on their way and that everything was going to be okay. But as she's talking to the kid, she had pretty much the same reaction as me, and there's a moment where she stops talking for a second and her nostrils flare from where she started to get an idea of how bad the kid smelled. And again, with the same air of indignation, the kid tells my mom that no one is going to be the one to tell him to take a bath. How he's a grown man, he wasn't, and how he can make his own decisions. My mom's face when he was telling her this was just a picture like me. She could literally not believe what she was hearing, nor could she believe the kind of situation that we had gotten ourselves involved with. Eventually, the cops showed up and tried to talk to the dad as he was screaming profanities at our front door. We watch from the window as he gets into a seriously heated argument with them to the point that they wrestle him to the ground before they detained him. This gave an opportunity to talk to the cops ourselves. And as crazy as the whole situation was, we had to tell them the truth of the matter, that the dad had actually tried to run his kid over, which was basically attempted murder. Naturally, the cops agreed and they arrested the guy, but not before asking him if he had in fact tried to run his kid over. The guy responded, "He's my son, my son. I'll raise him how I want. If he doesn't do what I tell him, I'ma whip him," basically confirming that he had tried to hit him with his truck. He was slurring his words the whole time, and it hit me at one point that the guy was pretty drunk from the way he was shouting and slurring at the cops. Definitely not a wise move on his part. That was all the cops needed apparently, so they put him in the back of their patrol car and took him to jail. That was most definitely one of the craziest things that's ever happened to me, and I suppose it doesn't help the whole Florida man thing that a guy might try to run over his kid for not taking a bath. I suppose, given the behavior of his kid, that this might be more like a Florida men story or like a Florida family story. But I promise, not everyone here is totally crazy, no matter how much the media makes it out that we're all just nuts. But saying that, since I moved out of state for college, it's definitely something that I've noticed about living further up the East Coast. Sure, there's crazy people everywhere, but the concentration of crazies in Florida is definitely higher than most other places. I'm just glad the situation that night got resolved. And as weird as it was, the outcome was considerably more preferable to just watching a half-naked kid get murdered by his own father. I would much rather just smell some body odor than watch someone die. That's for certain. At 19, I've lived in several homes, but two of them stand out as places where something felt deeply off. One was a trailer where I had a few eerie experiences, like doorknobs rattling by themselves and odd sounds that couldn't be explained. I also suffered from recurring nightmares and vivid hallucinations, but the worst place I ever lived in still haunts me to this day, even though it's been around 5 years since I left. This is the only time I've ever witnessed a spirit, or whatever you'd call it, and I genuinely hope it's the last. When I was 9, we moved into a 2-story house, and from the moment I set foot inside, I could feel that something was wrong. Unlike the trailer, which had this intense, chaotic energy, this house felt cold and lifeless. The air was still, and there was a sense of silence that made me feel uneasy, like the kind of quiet that suffocates you. Every room I entered filled me with a desire to leave as soon as possible, but the downstairs was by far the worst. I spent most of my time holed up in my room on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall, feeling safer there. The only time I felt okay on the 1st floor was during the daytime, but even then, I was nervous if I was ever truly alone down there. Over time, living in this house wore me down. By the age of 12, I had sunk into one of the darkest periods of my life. I stopped caring about school, my health, or anything really. I'd leave assignments until the very last minute, often writing essays the night before they were due. The family computer was downstairs in the dining room, and my parents' bedroom was right by the staircase. This meant I had to sneak around in the dark, using only the flashlight on my phone to guide me. Descending those stairs in the pitch black felt like something was waiting to grab me, but I couldn't run because I feared being caught by my parents. I'd scramble to finish my work, sitting in the dim light of the computer, often feeling like I might just collapse from the anxiety. I'd hear noises in the house and spin around, hoping it was my parents, but it never was. I still don't understand why I procrastinated so much, knowing how much it stressed me out. Despite the anxiety, the hardest part was always going back upstairs. For some reason, crossing the threshold of the staircase landing was terrifying. I would walk up backward, keeping my flashlight aimed down the stairs, moving so slowly that I'm surprised I didn't lose what little sanity I had left. I'm not sure how old I was when I saw the apparition, but I do know it happened on a day when I didn't have school, so I could stay up later. I was downstairs with my sister, playing video games, and it must have been around midnight. We had all the lights on. At one point, my sister mentioned going to her room, but I somehow assumed she'd be back downstairs soon. After a while, I realized she had actually left, and I was left alone. The familiar anxiety hit, so I decided it was time to go upstairs. To give you an idea of the 1st floor layout, there were no doors, just openings in the walls. This allowed you to walk in a circle around the central staircase. The living room, the largest space, had an open design so you could see the staircase landing from across the room. On the opposite side of the staircase was a den that led to the stairs as well. The kitchen and dining room were connected and separate from the staircase. There were also multiple light switches throughout the rooms. So, before heading upstairs, I would usually start in the den, making my way through the kitchen and dining room, then to the living room, turning off each light as I went. After the last light was off, I'd race through the living room toward the stairs. That night wasn't much different from the others. I was trying to stay calm, simply wanting to get upstairs and into my room. I went about it as casually as I could. I started in the den, turned off the light, then the kitchen, the dining room, and finally the living room, walking in a circle. But when I turned off the living room light and looked ahead, I swear I saw a woman. There was a faint light coming from a Coors decal that my stepdad had placed at the top of the stairs, and there she was, so vivid and real. The light cast shadows across her face, and she stood at the landing of the staircase in what looked like a nightgown. The light made her skin appear almost blue. She had short, shaggy black hair, but her face was clear, and her eyes, though sunken, were visible despite the dim light. Her nose was thin and slightly upturned, but it was her smile I'll never forget. It wasn't some creepy, toothy grin, just a subtle upturn of her lips. I couldn't tell if it was smug or kind. The most unnerving part was how tangible she seemed. Like I could actually see the space she occupied. I could see her standing behind the railing, swaying slightly in place. I was frozen in the doorway, between the dining room and living room. My hand was still on the light switch, but I couldn't move. It all felt like it happened in an instant, and I was paralyzed with fear, terrified to look away for even a moment. Eventually, I found the strength to flick the light back on, and as soon as I did, she vanished into the darkness. I kept staring at the spot she had been, desperately trying to find any trace of her. I stood there, rooted to the spot. I turned the dining room light back on, feeling slightly safer, and glanced at the clock. It had been 30 minutes. I panicked and turned on every light downstairs, even in the laundry room. But deep down, I knew I would have to turn them all off again, and I'd have to go back upstairs. That's where I knew I would be safe. I had to go there, but to get upstairs, I'd have to pass right by the spot where the woman had been. Just the thought of it sent chills down my spine. I spent almost an hour pacing back and forth between the living room and the den, glancing at the staircase. I kept searching for another way to get upstairs, but there was none. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay down there any longer, spirit or not. I wasn't going to spend the whole night trapped down there with her. So, I did what I'd done before, turned off the lights in a circle, making my way back to the living room. I took a deep breath, switched off the living room light, and thankfully, she was gone. I ran, telling myself to just get through it, to just get to the top and escape. The landing was freezing cold, and as I got closer, I felt like something was reaching into me, trying to drain the life from my body. I grabbed the railing and swung myself around onto the stairs, moving with such urgency that I'm surprised I didn't trip. I scrambled up the stairs, crawling as fast as I could, not caring who I woke up. I just needed to get away. I made it to the top faster than I thought possible and bolted to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it, just in case. I lay in bed, trying not to imagine her standing behind my eyelids every time I closed my eyes. I moved out of that house when I was 14 and into the trailer. That place had its own set of strange occurrences, but nothing has ever scared me like that house. Every time I question my beliefs, I think back to that moment. I know what I saw was real. It was such a powerful experience that it erased any lingering doubts I had about the existence of spirits. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget her. So, my cousin moved back to town a little over a year ago, maybe around April or June of 2018. She has 3 kids, and the youngest, a little girl, is 5 years old. Once they had settled into their new place, a few weeks went by, and I decided to visit with some other family members. We had a great time, enjoying good food and all that. After dinner, I remember my younger cousin, who was 4 at the time, wanted to play the cootie game. The game was upstairs in her room, and she needed someone to go with her because she was scared of something. I figured it was just her adjusting to the new house and being in a new environment. So, being the adult, I prepared myself to fight off any imaginary monsters or ink characters that might be lurking around. We reached her room, but she wouldn't even step foot inside. I asked her if something bad was in there, and she nodded, pointing to the game. I went to grab it, and then she told me to be careful in a certain corner of her room. I asked why, and she said, "That's where the screaming lady is. She's on fire and screaming a lot. I don't like her." Hearing this sent a chill down my spine, and my stomach sank. I quickly grabbed the game, and we headed back downstairs. Once we were in the living room again, my cousin acted totally normal, as if nothing had happened, and we played the game. Later that evening, I asked her mother, my first cousin, if she knew anything about the screaming lady. She said her daughter refused to sleep in her room, insisting that the lady needed to go away first. She'd been sleeping in her parents' bed nearly every night since they moved in. No one else had experienced anything unusual, but this little girl was absolutely terrified every night. About a month passed, and I didn't hear much more about any spooky occurrences. I started to think my cousin might just be experiencing recurring night terrors or something like that. Fast forward to yesterday evening, though. It was another one of my cousin's kids' birthdays, so I stopped by to give him the new Fire Emblem game for the Nintendo Switch. I usually stop by a few times a week since it's not far from my workplace, so nothing about today seemed out of the ordinary. We hung out, played some games, Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros., and everything was going well. That is, until later in the evening. We were waiting for pizza, and I was in the kitchen with my cousin, whose birthday it was, getting some soda. Out of nowhere, both of us noticed a distant smell of something burning. My cousin and her husband came out from the living room, thinking we had accidentally burned something, but of course we hadn't been cooking. The smell grew stronger and filled the house. If I had been blind, I would have sworn I was standing next to a huge bonfire, minus the heat. During this, my youngest cousin, now 5, was napping on the couch in the living room. She suddenly began yelling for her mom, who rushed over to check on her. Everyone else followed, and she was crying uncontrollably, screaming. I can hear the screaming lady in my room. I hear her screaming. At that moment, we all had the same sickening feeling I had when I first heard about the screaming lady. We all went upstairs, with her mom staying by her side. But when we got to her room, there was nothing there. However, the burning smell had changed. It no longer smelled like a bonfire, but like something I can only describe as the scent of burning hair, mixed with a smell I can't even compare to anything I've experienced before in my life. We quickly went back downstairs and shared what had just happened with her mom. She decided that it would be best for everyone to go outside to the front porch or patio area until the pizza arrived. My little cousin was still crying uncontrollably, insisting that she didn't want to hear the lady screaming anymore. We tried to calm her down, and eventually, she seemed to settle, no longer screaming, though still frightened. We stayed outside for about 10 minutes. My 2 other younger cousins and I were busy comparing our Pokemon Go collections, while my youngest cousin and her parents tried to distract her with some kid-friendly YouTube videos. Out of nowhere, we all heard the most chilling, blood-curdling scream coming from the second floor of the house. It lasted about 15 seconds, multiple long, horrifying screams. Then, as quickly as it began, everything fell silent. My 5-year-old cousin started throwing another fit, and everyone else was visibly shaken. At that point, I knew it was time to leave. It was around 9:30 p.m., and although the pizza was tempting, I had no appetite after that experience. I thanked them for ordering the pizza, even though I wasn't going to eat any, and they completely understood. I wished my cousin a happy birthday and told him not to spoil the new Fire Emblem game for me before heading home. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I didn't even turn off the light. I was exhausted at work today, and I'm still anxious about going to bed tonight. I texted my cousin a few times today and again this evening. She told me that the burning smell didn't go away until around 4 a.m., and no one slept in the house that night. They're now looking into getting help so they can feel safe in their home again. I feel awful for them, especially for my young cousin, who has been seeing the screaming lady in her room. I can't stop thinking about the smell from her room either. Throughout the day, I've been getting faint whiffs of that smell here and there, and I'm really hoping it's just a memory of it lingering and not something more sinister. I'm still not sure if I'll be able to sleep tonight, especially without the light on. It's been such a terrifying experience, and I knew I needed to share it with you all. I've had some spooky things happen over the years in various homes I've lived in, and maybe a few weird things at a friend's or family member's house, but nothing like this. I've never been this scared. I just hope my cousin and her family can figure this out and turn their house back into a place where they feel safe. Does anyone have advice I could pass along to them to help guide them as they seek some kind of assistance? Just a bit of background. My sister and I are 3 years apart, and I've always felt like a protective older brother to her. We've been really close throughout our lives, so what she experienced annoyed me a great deal. This happened a few years ago when our parents had recently split up, and my dad had found a new girlfriend. My mom had moved out and bought her own place, so it was just me, my sister, and my dad left in the house. My dad has since moved out of there. I was 18 at the time, and my sister was 15. Fast forward a few months, and that's when I first met my dad's new girlfriend. She was nice, really quiet, but at that time I wasn't too concerned about forming a relationship with her. The woman wasn't the problem, though. She had 2 daughters, whom we'll call Charlie and Rosie for the purposes of the story. Rosie was around 9 or 10 years old, and Charlie was about 13. Rosie was a little hyperactive but nice enough and pretty intelligent for her age. But Rosie was never the issue. It was always Charlie. The first time I felt weird about her was when my sister called me one time. I was staying at my mom's house, and my sister was at our dad's. She sounded freaked out, which immediately put me on high alert. My sister told me she'd been spending the night with our dad, his girlfriend, and the kids, and she was getting really strange vibes from Charlie the whole time. When it came to bedtime, Charlie insisted on sleeping in my sister's room. While my sister was getting ready for bed, she caught Charlie going through her stuff and, of course, told her off for it. But Charlie didn't seem embarrassed or ashamed at all. Then, when it was lights out, my sister heard a strange sound coming from the direction where Charlie was laying. My sister was confused and a little creeped out, and then Charlie got up and left the room to go to the bathroom. My sister told me that Charlie's phone was on and a picture of my sister and her friend was on the screen. My sister then told me that she was pretty sure that Charlie was touching herself over the picture. At this point, me and my sister already didn't like Charlie, but what happened next makes my skin crawl. So in our old house, our bathroom had a lockable door which could be unlocked from the other side as long as you had something like a coin to turn the lock. But when we were all getting along, me and my sister must have showed the girls this. One day, we're all at my dad's and downstairs getting ready to go out for the day, and my sister had said that she was going for a shower. I was downstairs being an adult and trying my best to get to know my dad's girlfriend that I didn't even notice Charlie slip out of the room. Then about 10 minutes later, I get a call from my sister asking me to come upstairs. When I go up, my sister looks panicked, clutching a towel around her still dripping from the shower. She begins to tell me that she heard knocking on the door to the bathroom. When she stopped the shower to ask who was there, no one responded. My sister says she finished her shower and when she got out, heard running down the stairs. When she looked at the door, it had been opened. Charlie had been watching my sister shower. This absolutely sickened me and still does, but I can't even imagine how my sister felt. Thankfully, my dad and his girlfriend broke up, and we've never had to see Charlie and Rosie again. And that's probably the way we'd like to keep it. It started with static. I was up late, flipping through channels on my old TV, half asleep in the glow of the screen. Most channels were dead air at that hour, nothing but the soft hum of white noise. But then, somewhere between channels, I found something, a signal. It wasn't clear at first, just flickering shadows, warped shapes moving behind a haze of static. I should have ignored it, just turned the TV off and gone to bed. But I didn't. The image sharpened. A hallway, long, dimly lit, stretching into darkness. The camera was shaky, like old home video footage. The walls were bare, featureless, the air thick with something unseen. Then the camera moved. Slowly, step by step, it crept forward, deeper into the hall. No sound, no voices, just the flickering light above, buzzing faintly. And then a figure appeared, standing at the far end of the hall, facing away. Still, motionless. I leaned in, my pulse quickening. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting. Then the static surged and the screen went black. I should have turned the TV off right then. But as I fumbled for the remote, the screen flickered back on. And the hallway was closer. The camera had moved forward just a few feet. The figure at the end of the hall was clearer now. Tall, thin, its arms hanging limply at its sides. Then its head twitched, not turning, just twitching, like it had heard something, like it had heard me. The static deepened, warping the screen, distorting the shadows. The camera jolted forward again, closer, closer. I grabbed the remote, my fingers shaking, and slammed the power button. The TV went dark. My apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt wrong. I sat there, breathing hard, telling myself it was just a bad signal, just a strange broadcast. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it, a faint buzz, like static. I turned slowly, my stomach nodding. The TV was off, but the screen wasn't empty, a reflection, not mine. Something else was standing behind me, watching, smiling. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My fingers clenched around the armrest of the couch, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure in the reflection stood still, its grin too wide, its head cocked slightly to one side. Then the TV turned itself back on. The hallway was gone. The camera was no longer showing the screen. It was showing my apartment. From the corner of the room, the camera shook like someone was holding it. The frame was slightly tilted, making the shadows in the corners stretch unnaturally. My couch was visible on the screen. My chair, my bookshelf, me. I was watching myself on the screen. Then, in the reflection on the TV screen, the figure behind me moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. The static grew louder. The image on the TV flickered, distorting. The lights in my apartment dimmed, buzzing faintly. I turned around. Nothing was there. But when I looked back at the screen, the figure was right behind me. Its mouth stretched wider. The static on the TV turned into a sound, low, humming, almost like a voice just beneath the surface. Then the screen cut to black, and the knocking started. 3 sharp knocks. From inside the screen, something wanted out. Before I begin telling you this terrifying story, I want you to do something for me. Think of the one person in your life that you have a genuine, trusting connection with. Not a romantic connection, just a friendship. Think of the person who's always been there for you, who you can count on for anything, big or small. It doesn't matter how you met or how long you've known each other. Do you have that person in mind? Good. I hope this story doesn't change the way you see them. Back at the end of 2018, I was a sophomore in college studying physics. I was enrolled in one of my final calculus courses, and on the very first day of class, I sat down next to a guy who would later become one of my closest, most trusted friends. For the sake of this story, let's call him Tony. At the time, I was a female student, and when we first met, there was a bit of a natural attraction, I won't lie. But it was nothing more than the simple thought, that person is good looking. Nothing ever came of it, and it felt like we were always meant to be just friends. We started studying together for exams, and whenever I needed help with a physics chapter, he would go out of his way to meet up with me and help me out. We shared everything about ourselves, not in a flirtatious way, but more like we were long-lost friends. At that point, I was managing a well-known retail store, and during the Christmas season of 2018, I was looking for seasonal workers. I offered Tony a job, and we maintained a manager-employee relationship at work. Outside of work, though, we were just regular friends. He was one of the best salespeople I had on staff. He caught on quickly and got along with everyone. He was hilarious, and I honestly enjoyed working with him. Once the Christmas season ended in January of 2019, he left the store, and we just carried on with our normal friendship. Unfortunately, by the end of 2019, we somehow stopped talking. There was no argument or falling out, and we still liked each other's posts on Facebook and Instagram. Then, in 2020, the news broke. My new best friend was planning something terrible for our school. Tony was arrested on federal charges for making threats against the school. He had been planning it for a long time, and he was ready. He had said he would gather enough people to make himself a legend. He even had a list of people he wanted to take care of, and I was on that list. The person I trusted, the person who had been one of my closest friends, had been planning something unimaginable. He had been someone I counted on, but in the end, I learned the hardest way that you can't trust anyone. For a little background, I'm a guy from a small town in Nevada. Life here can get a bit dull, especially if you're not into the whole gambling scene that takes over the nightlife. But there are a couple of things I really enjoy, like off-roading in my ATV or going on long hikes with my dogs, Buddy and Snoopy. Right behind my house, there's a desert that stretches for miles, so I don't have to worry about traffic or other people. I can let my dogs run wild and enjoy the open space. There are also two big mountains a few miles away that I like to hike up. These mountains, Mountain A and Mountain B, are only about half a mile apart. In the winter, these mountains can be pretty tough to hike. I've labeled them A and B for convenience. Mountain A is easier because it has a clear trail leading up to it, while Mountain B is more rugged, rocky, and steep. The day before I went on this particular hike, the weather had been terrible. Almost everything was snowed in, and the wind was strong enough to knock over a semi-truck. But by morning, most of the snow had cleared up and the wind had died down. The conditions weren't perfect, but I decided to go ahead with the hike. My dad didn't think it was a good idea for me to go alone, so he and my aunt decided to join me. Instead of taking the usual route to Mountain A, my aunt suggested we hike up Mountain B since the sun was shining on that side. I was hesitant at first because of how steep it was, but I agreed, and we started our hike. The desert ground was muddy, and the bushes were covered in snow. Light snowflakes were still falling on our faces, and the sky was finally beginning to clear. As we neared Mountain B, we saw tire tracks on the snowy trail that looked like they had been there for a day or more. We thought it was odd, considering the weather, but didn't dwell on it too much. One thing that always intimidated me about this mountain was the sharp rocks on the trail. With the snow and ice covering them, they looked even more menacing. Thankfully, we carefully made our way over them and reached the top of the mountain, exhausted but proud of our accomplishment. The summit didn't look like I had expected. There were food wrappers, beer bottles, and dead bushes scattered all over. Despite the mess, I still enjoyed the view and started snapping pictures of the dogs and the scenery, with the town in the background. But then I noticed both Buddy and Snoopy sniffing around a dead bush. I called them over, but they didn't listen. When I went over to grab them, I saw what looked like burnt pieces of cardboard scattered around the dirt and some on the bush. I thought it was just trash at first. When I picked up one of the burnt pieces, I realized it wasn't just cardboard. It looked like part of an old photograph. The photo was in black and white, and I could make out an eye in the piece I held. What was strange was that this eye looked familiar, like I had seen it before. It gave me an uneasy feeling. My dad and aunt thought it was weird but didn't think much of it. They were ready to head back home, so we started down the mountain. But something kept nagging at me, and I felt like I needed to go back and take a closer look at the pieces. My dad and aunt agreed to turn back, so we did. We started collecting the burnt pieces of the photograph, struggling to piece them together because they were so damaged. It felt like we were solving a puzzle, each fragment looking more like a jumbled mess than a coherent image. After some effort, we finally managed to assemble the pieces, and what we ended up with was a large photograph about 18 by 20 inches. It was pretty big. I placed the last two pieces together, stepped back, and then I saw it. My heart stopped. It was a photograph of my deceased grandfather. I was frozen in shock. Who would do something like this? It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. One of those moments where the characters don't realize the danger, and the audience is yelling for them to run. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind started racing. This was the same photo we had at home, the one I thought was the only one in existence. Seeing it here in pieces on the mountain, it didn't make sense. I thought someone had broken into our house, stolen the photo, and was trying to send us some twisted message. I immediately feared for my family's safety, convinced that something terrible was about to happen or that someone was playing a cruel prank on us. We grabbed all the pieces, and as we scrambled down the mountain, I tried calling my mom, but my phone had no signal. My dad and aunt weren't as shaken as I was, but they were still pretty freaked out. We didn't have the energy to run, so we jogged home, the wind picking up again as the sun began to set. All I could think about was making sure my family was okay. I kept looking over my shoulder, still unsettled by the whole situation. Thankfully, we made it home without incident. When I saw my mom in the kitchen and my brother playing video games, I felt a huge sense of relief. I hugged her tightly, and she was confused at first, not understanding why I was so shaken. That's when I finally told her everything. I showed her the assembled photograph, and her face went pale. This was her father, and she was just as terrified as I was. I immediately went to her room, knowing she kept the original photo of my grandfather hanging on the wall. When I saw that the photo was still there, perfectly intact, it only deepened the mystery. My mom had always believed there was only one copy. My grandfather had lived his whole life in California, and tragically, he was murdered in front of his home by gang members. My mom was very young at the time, and the killers had been after her older brothers as well. After his death, my family moved to Nevada to escape the violence. The only explanation we could come up with was that these gang members somehow found out where we lived and were trying to send us a message by destroying the photograph of my grandpa. That whole month, we slept with one eye open, always on alert, and tried to be extra cautious about everything we did during the day. I never hiked those mountains again. We rarely ventured outside. I just needed answers. Who had done this and what were their intentions? My mom wanted to tell my grandma about the situation but didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. Eventually, she did tell her everything. That's when we found out that my grandma had also owned a copy of the same photograph. What my grandma told my mom about the photo shocked her. She revealed that she was actually the one who had made the decision to get rid of it. The night before we took our hike, she told one of my uncles to take the photo and destroy it because she felt an unsettling presence around it. She said that every time she looked at the photo, the eyes seemed to be staring back at her, no matter where in the room she was. That's when it clicked for me. When I saw that eye from the photo in the desert, it creeped me out because I knew I had seen those eyes before. One thing that still bothers me is how my uncle managed to drive all the way up that mountain, especially with the weather being so bad and it being pitch black. We shared the story with him and he confirmed it. He said that he and his brother had been out drinking, and in the dark, they decided to drive up the mountain to get rid of the photo. He tried burning it, but the wind was so strong that he ended up tearing it apart with his hands. He said it was a tough climb up the mountain, but he wanted to get the photograph as far from my grandma as possible. But what's still strange to me is how we ended up finding the pieces of the photo, almost like it was fate. I mean, I never would have gone up that mountain if it weren't for my aunt. It's almost like the photo had wanted to stay in the family, like it had a purpose. Despite the strong wind and heavy snow the night before, the pieces didn't blow away or get buried in the snow. They were just lying there, close to each other, as if they had been waiting to be found. It's strange, almost like the photo wanted to remain intact, to stay together in one piece. When I was a kid, I always dreamed of becoming a Boy Scout. Back then, it was still a respected group that taught useful outdoor skills. I think I was around 10 when I finally convinced my mom to let me join. She was hesitant at first. Growing up in Russia, she'd seen scout-like groups used more as military training for children. I asked the den mother to talk to my mom, and after a long series of questions, her concerns were eased. With that, I was finally allowed to join the Cub Scouts. Unfortunately, I quickly realized that scouting in my area wasn't quite what I had imagined. Our den mother turned out to be a neurotic single mom with little motivation. It was a major letdown for me, but after about 6 months, a small glimmer of hope appeared. A scout leader from a nearby county invited our den to join his group for a camping trip. This was a big reason I had joined in the first place. I loved camping with my family, but after my parents separated, those trips stopped. The scout leader picked us up early on a Saturday morning and drove us all to the campsite. There weren't many of us, maybe about 9 kids in total. He gathered us together and gave us instructions on how to set up our tents. Each tent was meant to hold 2 boys, but since there was an odd number of us, I got a tent to myself. One by one, the leader showed us where to set up, and we started pitching our tents. Some needed help, but for the most part, the experience went smoothly. The rest of the morning was spent learning about first aid and general safety. I was paired with a leader and became the visual aid. For the next few hours, I was wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift litter. It was fun, and it turned out to be useful in situations that would come later. Once the first aid training was done, we had lunch and were allowed a little siesta. This lasted until around 3 p.m. when we were all gathered for archery lessons. I was beyond excited. Ever since I saw my first ninja movie, I'd fantasized about shooting a bow. This is my first and last chance for a long while. The leader gave us a brief instruction on how to shoot. He was naturally very persistent about safety, but you can imagine a bunch of hyped-up preteen boys weren't really paying much attention to that part. I was the first to shoot. As I drew back the string, I can remember squatting down like a ninja. I was scolded for this and made to stand upright. This made the experience a bit less exciting, but seeing the arrow hit where I'd been aiming was exhilarating. The rest of the boys went and turned after me. Only then were we allowed to shoot on our own. Everyone was chattering amongst themselves trying to outshoot the kid next to him, and then it happened. A kid named Kevin was talking to another boy next to him named Chris. Kevin had the arrow knocked and the string pulled back about a quarter of a full draw when Chris said something that caused Kevin to turn toward him. Kevin must have lost grip on the string, or maybe he let go and lied his way out of it later. Either way, the arrow hit Chris in the chest and penetrated about 8 inches. Panic ensued. The scout leader began yelling out for the first aid supplies. Chris was freaking out and already having a hard time breathing. There really wasn't much the scout leader could do but pack the area around the wound and try to keep Chris calm. 2 boys were given the task of running the half-mile to the ranger station, and the rest of us just stood around and stared silently. All except for Kevin, of course. He paced around saying "I'm sorry" over and over until the scout leader told him to shut up. The ambulance arrived around 20 minutes later, probably the longest 20 minutes of my young life. And this was the end of the trip. Everyone packed up their stuff as quickly as possible and we all returned home. During the ride home, the seriousness of the situation must have hit Kevin hard. I can still remember his horrible wailing to this day. In my opinion, it was nothing more than terrible accident. There are a few others, however, who remember things differently. According to one boy, Chris had called Kevin a name no boy our age wanted to be called, and Kevin shot him for it. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken to anyone about it. News of Chris's condition didn't reach me until the following morning. He had been rushed in a surgery and it had gone well. The arrow had punctured Chris's left lung, just missing his heart by an inch. He did manage a full recovery. Kevin was probably the happiest to hear this news. All involved agreed it had been an accident and no charges were brought against him. And a few months later, the 2 boys had a meeting in which Kevin formally apologized to Chris. And from what I hear, Chris did accept. As far as I know, he's never held a grudge. Not even I got away completely unscathed. The second my mom heard about that incident, my scouting days were over. I wasn't too disappointed though. Instead, I got into BMX and I guess that turned out to be a far safer experience. It was a snowy night when I pulled into the parking lot of the gas station for my overnight shift. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. hours and had been on the job for several months by then. To be honest, I really disliked the work, but finding something else was tough. And because of some things going on in my personal life, the night shifts worked better with my schedule. Even so, I always showed up exhausted and struggled to get through each shift. I parked next to the only other car in the lot, my coworker's, and went inside to take over his shift. He left a couple of minutes later, leaving me alone for the rest of the night. My manager had left a note on the desk with a few tasks to complete, but after reading it, I figured it wouldn't take more than an hour to get everything done. I tried to put off doing the work as long as I could, hoping to avoid falling asleep as I got more tired. But around 12 a.m., a car pulled into the station, pulling me from my distracted thoughts. I glanced out the window and saw an old SUV parked at one of the pumps. Since it was snowing heavily, not many people were out driving, but getting the occasional customer wasn't unusual. I went back to scrolling through videos on my phone, not paying much attention, until I glanced up again about 10 minutes later and saw the SUV was still there by the pump. The headlights were off and the doors were closed. It looked like the car should have been in use, but it had been so long. I stood up and walked closer to the window, scanning both sides of the building, but there was no sign of anyone outside. If someone had been sitting in their car for the past 10 minutes with the engine off, they'd have to be freezing. The snow, wind, and cold made me feel uneasy for them. I stayed alert for a few more minutes, hoping to see some movement inside the car or someone getting back in, but nothing happened. It felt as though the car had been abandoned right next to the pump. After a few more moments of wondering, I decided to put on my jacket and go outside. As soon as I stepped out into the cold, I knew I was right. There was no way anyone could be inside the car or standing outside for long with the engine off. I hurried over to the SUV and looked around before pressing my face against the window to peer inside. "Hello? Anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay," I called out. From what I could see, there was no one inside. The visibility was poor, so it was possible someone could have been hidden from view, but I was pretty sure the car was empty. Now even more confused, I backed up and looked around at the empty gas station parking lot before starting to walk back. Now with my eyes not focused on the car, I was just looking at the ground and noticed shoe prints in the snow going toward the building. Not really the front of the building, but kind of off to the side. I looked back and saw that they seemed to come from the car, but at this point, I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up a bit first. Inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute though, before a thump resonated through the building from behind me. I spun around, not seeing anything, then walked around the counter and toward the back. On the floor, there were puddles of dirty water, like snow that had melted off someone's boots. Feeling a chill run through me, I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner toward where the supply room was. Standing in the dark behind one of the shelves, I could see the outline of a figure. They were tall with broad shoulders and had a large scruffy beard, and they were looking right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to just walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too shocked to react appropriately. After staring at the doorway to the supply room for I don't even know how long, I quietly picked up the store phone and called the police, whispering for help. Then I endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room, which honestly added to my fear. For some reason, the man never came out to confront me. When two cops finally pulled in and came inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed by the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but outside were fresh tracks in the snow, going straight away from the gas station, straight into the completely dark, empty field that led on for miles. Obviously, nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the following days, they didn't find anything. I mean, the field was huge. He could have gone anywhere, but it was so cold and windy that night that I was almost sure that they'd find a body. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information. I don't know how or why, but for some reason, they couldn't find any history of ownership. So that left us with just what we know from that night, and we are still left with just that. Who the man was and what he was doing remains unsolved, and where he is now is just as much of a question. From mid to late 2018, I worked at a grocery store and deli, specifically in the deli bakery section. Towards the end of the year, I had just come out of a 2-year relationship, and it hit me pretty hard. I was in a funk because of it. Around that time, we hired a new employee in the deli, who we'll call John. I was scheduled to work on his first day, so I was one of the employees who trained him. John seemed like a nice guy, and he picked things up quickly, which was great. Fast forward to our next shift, and I was pretty close with another coworker who we'll call Jane. Jane knew all about my breakup and would check in on me from time to time, which John overheard. He came up to me on my break, apologized for what I was going through, and was just generally sweet about the whole situation. I appreciated it, so I thanked him. At that time, I didn't think much of it. I didn't think he was being weird, but if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have entertained it at all. After our next shift together, it was pouring rain, and the weather in mid-November where I lived is usually pretty cold. At the time, John didn't have a car, but he lived about 10 minutes from work, within walking distance. Looking back, my fatal flaw at the time was that I was way too nice to people. I offered him a ride since it was raining and freezing outside. The ride home was fine. He thanked me and said he'd see me the next day. This is where things started to go south. John began flirting with me, making inappropriate jokes, and even doing that thing where he would grab my hips and rub against me to get past me, often in front of customers. He also managed to get my phone number from my boss, claiming it was for shift coverage purposes. But then he started texting me constantly, professing his love for me and telling me he would treat me better than my ex had. On shifts where we had 3 people working, and one of us would go on break, John would use the opportunity to harass me more. At the time, I was very soft-spoken and terrified to speak up or stand up for myself. Eventually, I decided to put in my 2 weeks' notice, but not before sending him a text saying something like, "F you, you're gross. Lose my number and never talk to me again." He texted me back, apologizing and inviting me over to talk face-to-face to make up for it. As I said, my fatal flaw back then was that I was way too nice to people. In my head, I thought that I must have gotten through to him. I mentioned it to my friend who we'll call Eve, and Eve was very adamant that I tell him no and to leave it alone. Unfortunately, I chose not to listen to her advice. Instead, I told him that I appreciated the apology and that I would come talk to him, but I was going to bring Eve with me as I didn't trust being alone with him at his house. He agreed. Eve was very reluctant, but insisted I bring her along if I absolutely had to go just in case. We drove to John's house, and when we arrived, he didn't come out. I remember texting him a few question marks, and after having no reply, I turned around and left. He then texted me apologizing, saying to come back and talk to him in his car. Against Eve's better judgment, I turned around. I pulled back into his driveway and got an instant feeling of dread. Something absolutely did not feel right. I threw my car in reverse, but before I got the chance to move, his dad and his 2 brothers hopped out of the car and surrounded mine. They began pounding on my windows, trying to open the doors, and stood behind my car so I couldn't leave. Eve and I are obviously scared out of our minds at this point. I got a surge of adrenaline and didn't care who was behind me. I floored it out of the driveway. Thankfully, nobody was hit, but I sped off. I pulled into the parking lot of my work to collect myself and pulled my phone out to block his number. I then noticed a car speeding into the parking lot of my work, and they tried to surround me again. I don't know how I managed to get out of this, but I did. I then began getting calls from random numbers. I assume his dad and brothers, and they began threatening to kill me and say that they were armed and planned on shooting my tires. They followed us for quite some time, and Eve called the police. We were instructed to pull into a nearby gas station where an officer was already waiting. I did make a report, but they told me that ultimately, there was nothing that I could do or that could be done. I did end up reporting this to my manager, who told me that they couldn't do anything either as it happened off company property, which is only half true. I didn't stay my full final 2 weeks. John continued to harass me anonymously for months after this, and law enforcement refused to help me. Their excuse was that nothing could be done unless he acted on his threats. Whenever I would visit the area, he would somehow always find me and follow me until I would get onto the highway. I will admit that this is mostly my fault for being so trusting and thinking that John actually wanted to speak with me and be civil, and I should have listened to Eve from the get-go. It isn't my fault for being harassed, but I shouldn't have been so trusting because I could have avoided the majority of this problem. It's been nearly 2 years since this happened, and I've not heard from nor seen John since. I just hope that it stays that way. The scenery was incredible, but so was the pressure around my neck. I should have trusted my instincts and stayed on the main trail, but it's always clearer in hindsight when you're fighting for your life. It all started as a perfect hiking day in Yosemite. The sun was shining, the air fresh, and the trail unusually quiet. I enjoyed the peace, the sound of gravel beneath my boots, and the occasional bird call. Everything felt in harmony. After about 2 hours of walking, I stumbled upon a group of hikers gathered around a map. They were chatting and laughing, their voices carried by the gentle breeze. As I got closer, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard looked up and waved. "Hey there," he said. "You look like you know your way around. Mind helping us out?" I grinned, always ready to lend a hand to fellow hikers. "Sure, what do you need?" The bearded man introduced himself as Mike and motioned toward his companions. 2 women and another man, all seemed friendly enough, with easy smiles and casual postures. "We're trying to find this viewpoint," Mike explained, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's supposed to be breathtaking, but it's off the beaten path. You wouldn't happen to know it, would you?" I leaned in, inspecting the map and frowning slightly. "I don't think I've been there. Is it safe?" One of the women, Sarah, who had introduced herself, reassured me. "Oh, it's perfectly safe. We've been there before. It's just a bit tricky to find if you don't know the way." I hesitated, glancing between their friendly faces and the map. A small voice inside me urged caution, but I ignored it. After all, discovering hidden spots with new people was part of the adventure. "You know what? I'd love to check it out. Mind if I tag along?" Their faces brightened, and Mike gave me a hearty clap on the shoulder. "Absolutely. The more the merrier. It's about an hour off the main trail, but it's worth it." We set off, veering off the familiar path. At first, the conversation flowed easily. We shared stories of past hikes, compared gear, and admired Yosemite's natural beauty. But as we ventured further into the wilderness, the tone shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by low whispers that I couldn't make out. Every time I looked back, I saw them exchanging glances, silent, loaded looks that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. After about 45 minutes, I noticed we were no longer following any discernible trail. The undergrowth was thick, snagging at my clothes and scratching my exposed skin. Sweat beaded on my forehead, not just from exertion, but from growing anxiety. "Hey guys," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the dense forest. "Are you sure we're going the right way? I don't see any signs of a trail." Mike turned back, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Don't worry, we're almost there. Just a little further." I nodded, swallowing hard. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The cheerful birdsong from earlier had given way to an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and my increasingly rapid breathing. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. My heart sank as I realized there was no breathtaking view, just more trees and a sheer cliff face. "I don't understand," I said, turning to face the group. "Where's the viewpoint?" The atmosphere changed in an instant. The friendly smiles were gone, replaced by cold, calculating stares. Mike took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed away. "Oh, there's a view all right," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Just not the one you were expecting." My back hit the cliff face and panic surged through me. "What's going on? What do you want?" Sarah let out a chilling laugh. What we want. We want everything you've got. Your gear, your money, your identity, and you're going to give it all to us." My mind raced, searching for a way out, but they had positioned themselves between me and the only exit from the clearing. I was trapped. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just take my stuff. I won't tell anyone, I swear. Just let me go." Mike shook his head, pulling a knife from his belt. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, we can't risk you running back and alerting the rangers. No, you're going to have a little accident. It's tragic, really. Solo hiker, unfamiliar terrain, one wrong step." The reality of my situation hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just robbers. They were killers, and I was their next victim. Adrenaline surged through my veins. In that moment, survival was all that mattered. I feigned a move to the right, then ducked left, trying to slip past Mike. But he was faster, his hand shooting out to grab my arm. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. His fingers dug into my flesh as he dragged me back towards the cliff edge. The others closed in, their faces masks of cruel determination. My heel hit a rock, and I stumbled, nearly going over the edge. Mike's grip on my arm was the only thing keeping me from plummeting to my death. The irony wasn't lost on me. My would-be killer momentarily becoming my lifeline. As I teetered on the brink, time seemed to slow. I saw the knife in Mike's other hand, inching closer to my throat. I saw Sarah and the others, watching with a mix of anticipation and cold indifference. And I saw my life, flashing before my eyes in a cliché I never thought I'd experience. In that moment of clarity, a surge of defiance welled up inside me. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my arm free from Mike's grasp. The sudden movement caught him off guard. He stumbled forward, his eyes widening in surprise as he lost his balance. I watched in shock as he tipped over the edge, his scream echoing off the cliff face as he plummeted out of sight. For a split second, everyone froze. Then chaos erupted. Sarah lunged at me, her face contorted with rage. I ducked, feeling her fingernails graze my scalp as she missed her grab. The other man came at me from the side, but in his haste, he tripped over a root. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I could hear them behind me, their shouts growing fainter as I put distance between us. I had no idea where I was going. The forest all looked the same, an endless maze of trees and shadows, but I kept running, driven by pure survival instinct. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every rustling leaf sent a jolt of terror through me. After what felt like hours, I burst out onto a trail, actual beautiful man-made trail. I could have wept with relief. Instead, I pushed on, my legs trembling with exhaustion but refusing to give up. Finally, mercifully, I saw buildings ahead, the visitor center. Safety. As I staggered into the parking lot, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. A park ranger rushed over, concern etched on his face. "Sir, are you all right? What happened?" The words tumbled out of me in a jumbled mess. The group, the fake viewpoint, the attack, the chase. The ranger's expression shifted as he absorbed my story, his eyes widening in shock before he immediately radioed for backup. The next few hours blurred together, an endless cycle of questions, statements, and search teams. They discovered Mike's body at the bottom of the cliff, exactly where I'd said he'd fallen. But Sarah and the others? They were gone, vanished without a trace. As I sat in the ranger station, wrapped in a shock blanket and clutching a cup of tepid coffee, the weight of what had transpired began to settle in. I had come so close to dying. I had witnessed a man die, and out there, somewhere, the rest of them were still free, possibly searching for their next victim. The head ranger walked over, his face solemn. "We need you to stay here for a while, sir. We'll have more questions, and we'll need your help identifying the suspects." I nodded, numb. Even after I left Yosemite, I knew I wouldn't truly escape the events of that day. The memory would haunt me, forever tied to those fake smiles, the icy glares, and the helplessness I felt standing at the edge of that cliff. But I had survived. Against all odds, I had made it out alive. And as I gazed out the window at the towering peaks of Yosemite, I silently promised myself that I would never again ignore that small voice of caution. I would never again be an easy target. And one day, I would find the strength to return to these trails, because I refused to let them take this place from me. Yosemite, with all its breathtaking beauty and hidden dangers, was now a part of me, for better or for worse. A single phone call can change everything, but for Karen Faulkner, 3 phone calls would alter her life in ways she could never have imagined. 2 of those calls came within hours of each other on January 1st, 1993. The first was from her mother, telling her that her older sister had gone missing after a New Year's Eve celebration. The second call brought even worse news. It was her father, telling her that a body had been discovered. Karen's sister, Kimberly, had been murdered. Over the next 18 years, Karen and the Faulkner family mourned, processed their grief, and slowly moved forward. But then, on one fateful day, the phone rang again. The story of Kimberly Dean Duncan's murder is both chilling and tragic. Kimberly was a 30-year-old woman, married with 2 young children, living in Aloha, northeast Portland. She and her husband had planned to attend a New Year's party together, but Kimberly went alone after her husband sustained a back injury and was bedridden in severe pain. As the night turned into early morning, Kimberly still hadn't returned home by the time she was expected. Her husband, initially frustrated by her tardiness, something that wasn't uncommon after a night of drinking, became increasingly concerned as hours passed with no word. He called several friends who had also been at the party, but when one finally picked up, he learned that Kimberly had left the gathering hours before, sober and intent on heading home. Meanwhile, a local resident noticed a parked car in a neighborhood not far from where Kimberly had been. At first, the person assumed the driver was simply too drunk to continue and had decided to sleep it off. However, when the car remained there the next morning, the concerned passerby called the police. Upon arriving at the scene, officers discovered the body of a woman slumped behind the steering wheel, dead from a single close-range gunshot to the head. After searching the vehicle, the police found identification that confirmed the deceased woman was Kimberly Jean Duncan. An autopsy revealed that traces of narcotics were found in her system, which led the police to consider the possibility that she might have been involved with dangerous drug dealers. This revelation left Karen in turmoil. While Kimberly had experimented with drugs in her youth and even struggled with addiction at one point, she had recently assured her family that she was clean and sober. Still, despite her troubled past, Karen was determined to honor her sister's memory. She needed to know what happened to Kimberly, and, most importantly, who was responsible for her death. When Karen reached out to the Cold Case Homicide Unit for updates on the investigation, she was shocked to learn that there was nothing new. The department had a caseload of 273 cases and only 3 full-time detectives. Karen quickly realized how overwhelming the situation was. They were hideously overloaded with work. Months later, Karen called again. Same status. She called again. Within the unit, she became known as a bit of a pest. On one call, she reached a detective newly assigned to cold cases. He told Karen to call whenever she wanted, and he'd keep her informed of any developments. This kind of personal touch meant a lot to her. Her sister had been a living, breathing person, not an item that had been stolen or a piece of property that had been damaged. It was during one of these conversations with the new officer that she learned about a certain deck of playing cards. The unit sergeant had just come back from a national police convention where he'd learned that some police agencies were using the cards to solve cold case murders. Each card featured the victim's face, some details, and a number to call. The cards were distributed to jails and prisons with the hopes that an inmate might remember something. Faulkner made it her mission to get her sister's case on one of the 52 cards. She called and she pastored and she called again. When the first deck of cards was placed in Oregon's institutions, Duncan's case was featured on the 10 of diamonds. 2 years later, an inmate was playing cards in an Oregon penitentiary held the 10 of diamonds in his hands. He read about the case and by pure coincidence, Something about it sounded strangely familiar to him. If he could provide the authorities with pertinent information, it could be a bargaining chip on his case. Authorities agreed to work with him. On pretense, they moved the man to a hospital, had him wear an undercover wire, and listened as he called his old friend to come see him. In the hospital room, he got his friend to talk about the case. Days later, authorities made an arrest. That's when Karen Faulkner received the third phone call. On June 15, 2010, Karen was driving on the freeway when her cell phone rang. The cold case detective told her to get her family together and come right away. "We walked into a room and everyone was standing and waiting for us," she said. The original detective who had worked the case was retired, but he was there. He had tears in his eyes. The family was told that at 8:20 a.m. that very morning, authorities had arrested Brad Richard Ballantyne, 37, in connection with the murder. More than a year later, on Thursday, July 7th, Ballantyne pleaded guilty. The family knew who, but not why. Before sentencing, Ballantyne agreed to meet with the family in a jury room on the 5th floor, the Multnomah County Courthouse. "After all these years, we had the chance to confront him," Faulkner said. "He'd said he'd seen my sister at the store when she was leaving after getting some cigarettes. She pulled something out of her pocket and some money fell to the ground. He wanted to rob her. Brad Ballantyne wanted to get her out of sight, so he flirted with her and asked her to get in her car and follow him up the street. She was probably drunk," Faulkner said, "so she did." Ballantyne parked his car in front of hers. He came back to Duncan's car. He said she got mad, Faulkner related. "I think she must have realized something was wrong. He said she was disrespectful. He walked back to his car and got a gun. He came back and shot her. He fled with $68. I'll tell you what I'll never forget," Faulkner said. "He told us she never saw it coming." Karen's father died a year later. Her mother is still alive. "I wanted my parents to know what happened to their daughter," Karen had said. "I wanted them to know the killer had been caught. She'd be proud of me," Faulkner said, admitting she still thinks of her sister often. "She would have been as tenacious as I was had it been the other way around." As soon as we passed the Millbrook town sign, I could feel something was wrong. The fog that had forced us off the highway thickened, wrapping around our car like a suffocating veil. We had no idea that we were heading straight into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. I'm Jack, and what was supposed to be a simple family road trip turned into a desperate fight for survival in a town that seemed to exist out of time. It all began when my wife, Sarah, our two kids, Emma, 14, and Liam, 10, and I decided to head to my parents for their 40th anniversary. We'd taken this trip a dozen times, always on the same highway. But this time, an unexpected summer storm forced us to find a different route. "Dad, I think we're lost," Emma said from the back, staring at her phone, which was now completely useless without signal. "Great," I muttered. "We're not lost, honey," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're just taking a scenic route." Sarah gave me a look that told me she wasn't convinced. The GPS had failed us about an hour ago, right when the storm hit, leaving us relying on an old paper map and my questionable sense of direction. The fog was so thick that our headlights barely cut through it, and suddenly, a sign appeared in the distance. "Welcome to Millbrook, where time stands still." "Oh, thank God," Sarah sighed. "Maybe we can stop and ask for directions." I nodded in relief, glad to see some indication that we were close to civilization. A few minutes later, we rolled down what looked like the town's main street. Despite it being only 7 p.m., the town was eerily silent. No one was walking around, and there were no other cars. Just rows of quaint shops and houses that looked like they had been frozen in the 1950s. "This is weird," Liam said, his face pressed against the window. "It's like we're in an old movie." I couldn't argue with him. Something felt off about this place, but I couldn't pinpoint what. As we neared what looked like a diner, I decided to pull over. Maybe someone inside could help us get back on track. "I'll just go in and ask for directions," I told Sarah. "Won't be long." The moment I stepped out of the car, the air felt different, thick, almost suffocating. The fog clung to me like a damp blanket, and despite the summer heat, I felt a chill. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly in the window. I pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled overhead. Inside, a few patrons turned to stare at me. Their gaze was intense, unblinking, and I felt like I was being scrutinized under a microscope. "Hi," I said, walking up to the counter where a middle-aged waitress stood perfectly still. "We're a bit lost. Could you point us back to Highway 16? She tilted her head slowly, almost mechanically. "Highway 16? Never heard of it, stranger. Why don't you and your family come in for a bite? You look tired," she added, her voice flat. "A good meal will do you good." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. They were cold, calculating, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Thanks, but we really need to get going," I said, trying to remain polite. "If you could just—" "I insist," she interrupted, her voice turning sharp. "We don't get many visitors here in Millbrook. It would be rude to leave so soon." I looked around, and the other patrons were slowly standing up, moving toward me in perfect unison. Their faces were blank, emotionless. I backed towards the door. "Right. Well, thanks anyway," I stammered, fumbling for the handle. As I burst out of the diner, I could have sworn I heard the waitress say, "You can check out anytime you like him, but you can never leave." I ran back to the car, my heart pounding. "We need to go now." Sarah must have seen the panic in my eyes because she didn't argue. I gunned the engine, tires squealing as we took off down the empty street. "Dad, what's going on?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, sweetheart, but something's not right here. We need to find a way out of this town." As we drove, I noticed more unsettling details. All the clocks in town seemed to be stuck at 7:13. The few people we saw moved in strange, jerky motions, like marionettes on strings. And no matter which turn we took, we always seemed to end up back on that same main street. "Jack, look," Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. Through the fog, we could see the Welcome to Millbrook sign. But we were driving out of town, not in Impossible. I slammed on the brakes, my mind reeling. This can't be happening. "Maybe we should ask someone else for help," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "No. Did you see the way they looked at us? Like they wanted to eat us or something? We need to figure this out ourselves." We decided to park the car and try to find a way out on foot. Maybe we'd have better luck spotting an exit without the fog pressing in on all sides. I grabbed a tire iron from the trunk, just in case. Sarah gave me a look, but didn't object. "Stay close," I told the kids as we set off down the sidewalk. The fog seemed to part just enough for us to see a few feet ahead, then close behind us like a curtain. It was as if the town itself was alive, watching our every move. We walked for what felt like hours, but the hands on my watch never moved past 713. The streets were a maze, each turn leading us back to where we started. Panic was starting to set in. "Mom, Dad, look," Liam suddenly exclaimed, pointing down an alley we'd passed a dozen times before. But this time, something was different. A faint blue glow pulsed at the far end, barely visible through the fog. "Should we check it out?" Sarah asked, gripping my arm tightly. I nodded. "It's the only thing that's changed. It has to mean something." As we approached the light, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was very wrong here, but it was also our only lead. The source of the glow turned out to be an old television set, sitting incongruously in the middle of the alley. On its screen, a man in a 1950s suit smiled at us. "Welcome, travelers," he said, his voice tinny through the ancient speakers. "You've found the heart of Millbrook. Are you enjoying your stay? Who are you?" I demanded. "What is this place?" The man's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Millbrook is a special place. A place where time stands still, where the outside world can't touch us. You should be honored. We don't invite just anyone to join our little family." "We don't want to join anything," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We just want to leave." The man's expression darkened. "Leave? Oh, I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Millbrook needs new blood every now and then to keep things fresh. A chill ran down my spine as the implications of his words sank in. You can't keep us here, I said, gripping the tire iron tighter. Can't I? The man laughed. It was a horrible sound, like metal scraping on metal. Look around you. You're already trapped. The longer you stay, the more you'll become like us. Part of the town. Forever. As if on cue, I noticed a strange sensation in my limbs. They felt heavy, sluggish. I looked down into my horror, saw my skin taking on a waxy, artificial sheen. No, I shouted, smashing the tire iron into the TV screen. The image flickered, distorted, but the man's laughter continued. Run, I yelled to my family. Back to the car. Now, we took off down the alley, the laughter echoing behind us. As we ran, I noticed the town changing. Buildings shifted and warped. Streets rearranged themselves. The few townspeople we saw were transforming too, their features melting like candle wax, revealing something inhuman underneath. By some miracle, we found our car where we'd left it. As we piled in, I saw a crowd of not quite people emerging from the fog, moving towards us with unnatural speed. I gunned the engine, not caring which direction we went as long as it was away from here. The townspeople threw themselves at the car, their hands leaving smears on the windows. I plowed through them, feeling sick as they crunched under the wheels. We drove blindly through the fog, the town a nightmarish blur around us. I couldn't tell if we were just circling or actually making any progress, but I knew we couldn't stop now. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog started to thin. Through the windshield, I saw the Millbrook town sign coming into view. This was it. It was now or never. We'd either escape or we'd be trapped forever. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the engine protesting under the pressure. The sign loomed ever closer, growing larger. Just before we hit it, I could have sworn I saw the man from the TV standing by it, his expression twisted in rage. We collided with the sign at full speed. For a brief moment, it felt like we were pushing through some sort of barrier, like passing through a membrane, and then suddenly it was over. The fog disappeared as if it had never been there. Ahead of us stretched the highway, clear and normal, free of any mist. Looking back through the rearview mirror, there was no sign of Millbrook, just empty fields. We drove on in stunned silence for miles before I pulled over. We sat there, breathing hard, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Was that real? Emma asked quietly. I glanced at Sarah, seeing the same shocked expression on her face that I was sure mirrored mine. I don't know, I finally replied. But whatever it was, we got away. We continued our journey, sticking firmly to the main highway. But that feeling, the one that we had brushed against something we couldn't understand, lingered. A place where the rules of reality didn't seem to apply. And from that point forward, I knew I'd never take another unmarked exit. Some detours, once taken, can never be undone. And some towns, once entered, refuse to let you go. We arrived at my parents' place late that night. We never spoke of what happened. How could we? But from that night on, there was an unspoken bond between us, forged in the chaos of that impossible town. A reminder that there are still dark places in the world where logic doesn't hold, and where nightmares can come to life. And somewhere, waiting in the fog, Millbrook lurks, ready for its next visitors. Before I tell you this story, I just want to say that it doesn't have a particularly satisfying climax or ending. It defies all logic and sense, and it'll probably leave you feeling bewildered, just as it did to me while it was happening. That being said, it's still the creepiest series of events that has ever happened to me. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nathan and I would often take my family's large sea kayak across the nearby river to a small creek, about half a kilometer away, which ran next to an abandoned golf course. This creek was much slower moving than the large Hawkesbury River, and because of this, a lot of garbage and debris would collect at its mouth before gradually spreading throughout its length. Nathan and I spent a lot of time at that creek, even building a small jetty to tie the kayak to using long sticks and some baling twine from the hay bales we used to feed the horses back home. We used this jetty to moor the kayak while we navigated through the thorny mess of prickly pear cacti that lined the edges of the golf course. The golf course itself was incredibly eerie. No animals, birds, or even insects could be seen or heard. Every sound we made was echoed back at us from a nearby sandstone cliff face. The closest thing we saw to wildlife was a skeleton of a kangaroo, which we found during our second trip there. It was strange because we had only been to that spot about a week before, and there had been no corpse then. Yet there it was, right in the middle of the clearing. A full kangaroo skeleton, sun-bleached and scattered around. We picked up a few of the bones and examined them closely, guessing which part of the skeleton each bone came from before tossing them aside. I took the skull back with me in the kayak and placed it on my bookshelf when I got home that afternoon. I often took things back from our outings, though Nathan never did. He was always on the lookout for things for me to collect. The next time we went out to the creek, we decided to explore the waterway as far down as we could. We brought machetes and a small hatchet, the one we had used to build the jetty, and set off. The journey was difficult due to vines spanning the creek from bank to bank, sunken logs, and dense river weeds that made paddling nearly impossible. The water was full of garbage too, broken tubes, life jackets, boat propellers, you name it, it had all made its way there. When we finally reached a relatively clean area with dark, ominous water, I glanced down and noticed what looked like a doll's head just below the surface. I stopped paddling and craned my neck to see it more clearly. It was definitely a doll's head, about a foot under the water, as if it had been tethered to the riverbed. It was staring up at us with a blank expression and light blue eyes. A wave of panic washed over me as I stared at it. Before I could say anything, Nathan exclaimed, "Oh, cool!" and plunged his hand into the water. I could tell that he was surprised at how deep he had to reach to wrap his fingers around the head, but Nathan was a determined dude. He lifted the head out of the water and looked at me grinning. Streams of water running from his closed fist as he held it out toward me triumphantly. I took it reluctantly from him. It was a small doll's head, around 3 inches in diameter. The head was clearly sun-damaged, and as a result it had lost a lot of the paint features. There were no discernible pupils on the eyes, just the blue-colored irises. This gave the thing a really disturbing look. The first time I noticed the car, I thought nothing of it. Just another vehicle in the parking lot, unremarkable in every way. But as the nights wore on and it remained there, always in the same spot, always occupied, a chill began to creep up my spine. Little did I know, that seemingly innocuous car was about to turn my quiet night shift into a terrifying game of cat and mouse. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Meadowbrook Office Park for about 6 months. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me plenty of time to work on my writing. The massive complex was eerily quiet at night, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional whir of the cleaning crew's equipment to keep me company. My routine was simple: clock in at 11 p.m., make my rounds every hour, and spend the time in between at the security desk, alternating between watching the cameras and pecking away at my laptop. It was mind-numbingly boring most nights, but I preferred it that way. Excitement in this line of work usually meant trouble. The car first appeared on a Tuesday, a nondescript sedan, dark blue or maybe black. It was hard to tell under the orange glow of the parking lot lights. I noticed it on my 2 a.m. round, parked in the far corner of the lot. The windows were tinted, but I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. I made a note of it in my log but didn't think much more about it. Probably just someone taking a break on a long drive, or maybe a couple looking for some privacy. As long as they weren't causing trouble, it wasn't my problem. But the next night, it was there again. Same spot, same silhouette behind the wheel. I frowned as I noted it in the log for the second night in a row. Coincidence, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. By the 5th night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car was always there, always occupied, always still. I never saw it arrive or leave. It was as if it materialized out of thin air each night, bringing its mysterious occupant with it. I debated calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I was spooked by a parked car? They'd laugh me off the phone. Besides, technically, the vehicle wasn't doing anything wrong. Public parking lot, no signs prohibiting overnight stays. On the seventh night, things changed. I was at my desk, engrossed in a particularly tricky scene in my novel, when movement on one of the security monitors caught my eye. The car was moving, slowly cruising through the parking lot. It made a complete circuit before returning to its usual spot. My heart was pounding as I watched the figure in the driver's seat. For the first time, they moved, turning their head to look directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. There was no way they could know where the cameras were unless they'd been studying the lot. Studying us. I picked up the phone, my hand hovering over the keypad. But before I could dial, the figure in the car raised their hand and waved. Not a friendly wave, but a slow, deliberate movement. A message. They knew I was watching. I slammed the phone down and stood up so fast my chair toppled over. This was too much. I needed to confront this person, find out what they wanted. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and a tenuous grasp on my courage, I headed for the parking lot. The night air was cool on my face as I stepped outside, a stark contrast to the sweat beading on my forehead. The parking lot stretched out before me, a sea of shadows and reflected moonlight. And there, in its usual spot, sat the car. I approached slowly, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. As I got closer, I could see the figure more clearly. A man, I thought, though it was hard to be sure. He sat perfectly still, facing forward, showing no reaction to my approach. When I was about 10 feet away, I stopped. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shakier than I'd like. "This is private property. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave." No response. No movement. It was as if I was talking to a statue. I took another step forward, my flashlight beam landing on the driver's side window. "Sir, can you hear me? You need to." The engine roared to life so suddenly I nearly jumped out of my skin. The car's headlights flicked on, momentarily blinding me. By the time my vision cleared, the vehicle was already moving, peeling out of the parking spot with a screech of tires. I watched dumbfounded as it sped towards the exit. Just before it turned onto the main road, the car slowed. The driver's window rolled down, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the man inside. He turned to look at me, and even from a distance, I could see the wide, unsettling grin on his face. Then he was gone, the taillights disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally went back inside, I filled out an incident report with shaking hands. I knew how it would sound, paranoid security guard spooked by a parked car, but I had to document it. Something about that grin, that deliberate wave at the camera told me this wasn't over. I was right. The next night, the car wasn't there. I felt a mix of relief and unease as I made my rounds. Had he finally moved on? Or was this just the calm before the storm? I got my answer at 3 a.m. I was checking the cameras when I saw it, the now familiar sedan pulling into the lot. But this time, it didn't stop at its usual spot. Kept driving, circling the building slowly. Round and round it went like a shark circling its prey. I watched, transfixed, as it completed its third loop. Then, without warning, it turned, heading straight for the main entrance of the building. My building, where I sat alone and increasingly terrified. I scrambled to lock down the building, my fingers fumbling with the security system controls. Just as I hit the final button, I heard it, the squeal of tires on pavement, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on metal. He had rammed the front doors. Alarms blared as I grabbed my phone, finally making the call I should have made days ago. 911. "What's your emergency?" "There's someone trying to break into Meadowbrook Office Park." I shouted over the noise. "He's rammed his car into the building. Please send someone quickly." I could hear the car's engine revving, the sound of the man trying to dislodge his vehicle from the mangled doors. Any second now, he'd break through. "Sir, stay calm. Officers are on their way. Are you in a safe location?" "Safe? Was anywhere safe from this madman?" "I'm in the security office," I said, But I don't think another crash cut me off. He was through the doors. He's inside. I whispered into the phone. Oh God, he's inside the building. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. The power had cut out when he hit the building, and the emergency lights cast long, shifting shadows. Every corner, every doorway could be hiding my stalker. Sir? Sir, are you there? The 911 operator's voice sounded tinny and far away. I ended the call and turned off my phone. I needed to hide, to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps were getting closer. There was a storage closet behind my desk. I slipped inside, closing the door as softly as I could. The space was tight, filled with cleaning supplies and spare computer parts. I crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps entered the security office. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might give me away. Through a crack in the door, I could see a sliver of the room. A shadow passed by, pausing at my desk. "Oh, security guard," a sing-song voice called out. "Where are you hiding?" I pressed my hand against my mouth, stifling a whimper. The voice was filled with a horrible glee, like this was all some twisted game. Come out wherever you are," he continued. "Don't you want to know why I've been watching you all this time?" I didn't move, didn't breathe. The shadow moved again, and I caught a glimpse of the man for the first time in full light. He was ordinary looking, which somehow made him even more terrifying. This wasn't some movie monster. This was just a man with a wide manic grin and eyes that gleamed with malice. He was standing right in front of the closet now. Surely he could hear my heart pounding. It seemed to echo in the small space, a drum beating out my terror. His hand reached for the doorknob. In the distance, I heard sirens. The cavalry was coming, but would they be in time? The doorknob began to turn. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but then the sirens grew louder, much louder. The man paused. "Well," he said, his voice now tight with anger, "looks like our game will have to wait for another night." The shadow moved away. I heard rapid footsteps, then the screech of tires. By the time the police burst into the office, the man was long gone. They found me still crouched in that closet, shaking and unable to speak. It took hours of questioning before I could tell them everything. About the car, the nightly vigils, the chase. They promised to investigate and find the man who had terrorized me, but they never did. The car was found abandoned a few miles away, wiped clean of prints. The man had vanished into the night. I quit my job the next day and found a new apartment in a new city. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that someday I'll look out my window and see that car, waiting, watching, ready to resume our twisted game of cat and mouse. Every night I check my locks. Every night I peer out into the darkness. And every night I wonder, is this the night he comes back for me? I work at a small organic grocery store that, surprisingly, sees its fair share of strange customers. We get a lot of conspiracy theorists who always seem to want to talk to me for some reason. These people are weird and sometimes get a bit aggressive and uppity when I don't respond to their long-winded monologues. But honestly, they don't scare me. I'm lucky to work with a fantastic team of managers who aren't afraid to take over if things get out of hand. The person who actually scares me the most, though, is someone who rarely ever talks to me. He's a regular at the store, one of the many homeless people who stop by every now and then. Most of them are lovely, albeit a little odd. This guy works at a store nearby and lives in his car, so he'll often drop in several times a day. He said all sorts of crazy things to my coworkers unprompted, and often for ridiculously long stretches of time. One time, he told one of my coworkers that because he wasn't white, he was the son of the Antichrist. I've even heard him growl at a coworker because he had to swipe his card again. Customers have complained about him saying weird things to them, too. The worst thing he does, though, is stand and stare at us, specifically the employees. Sometimes, he'll just stand in front of the checkout lines, not holding anything, not trying to check out, just standing there, staring at us. His behavior is starting to ramp up, and I'm genuinely afraid of him now. The staring and the bizarre comments were bad enough, but this next incident is what made me genuinely fearful. One night, I had gotten my work done early, so I decided to do some shopping around 8 p.m., just an hour before closing. There were very few people in the store, and of course our scary friend, who we all have various names for, but I mostly call him Squinty, was there. He's always glaring at us with his eyes narrowed. He was wandering around slowly, as he usually does, and every time I looked behind me, he was right there, following me into the aisle. It was starting to freak me out. Even when I grabbed the few things I needed, he would follow me, even into aisles where he'd just been. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Later, a wonderfully kind manager convinced me to let him send in a report so they could look at the security footage. Since then, his behavior has gotten even more unsettling. One night, he came in exactly at 8:45 p.m. He's been coming in nearly every day for years, so he knows what time we close. He also knows I almost always close in the evenings, usually working several days in a row. That night, as I was about to count my till, I turned around and swore that as soon as I did, he was standing right at the entrance, hands in his pockets, completely still, just staring at me. My manager walked me to the office, and he didn't move an inch until I was safely inside. I had the store manager walk me to my car. He isn't the most sensitive person. He wants to see the best in everyone, oftentimes against the wishes of his employees. But even he was telling me he never comes in this late. As I was putting things into my car, he said, "Oh, that's weird." I look up and sure enough, there he is standing by his car and staring in my direction. Once I see him, he slowly gets in his car and just sits in it, not moving. He didn't follow me out of the parking lot, but I still took turns in back roads to make sure he didn't follow me. I was feeling pretty good this week. He didn't come in very much, and when he did, my manager would see him and tell him to go sit in the cash office before he could even lay eyes on me, then come get me when he left. I felt safe and thankful for these wonderful people. Then the other night, close to closing, I turn around to get some bags ready, and he is standing outside the window, right in front of me, staring at me, hands in his pockets, mask on his face so I can't see his expression, just his squinting, glaring eyes. I was shocked, and of course at that moment I had a rush of customers and no other workers around me to help. My manager was on break. The store manager was somewhere way in the back. I was the closing cashier, and I was all alone, except for the few very disinterested late-night customers that were now impatiently standing in my line. I kept going as he walked into the store. He disappeared for a moment, as is the layout of the store, and later my coworker in another department, also a young female working alone, came up front to tell me he was slowly walking through those aisles, not looking for anything. Not looking at anything but her. Finally, my manager came back. I quickly told her I needed to go to the back, and as I did, the man comes moseying up to the front to stand in front of my register, once again staring at me. I turn off my light, and she turns hers on, and I work to finish the transaction I was on. He has nothing in his hands. He's not trying to check out, but he's standing there like he's waiting in line. I put my close sign up. He doesn't move. As soon as I finish, I all but run back to the cash office. He was there for another 20 to 30 minutes before leaving. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but every time he enters the store, my stomach drops. He's barely ever spoken to me, but I can't help but feel like he knows I reported him and knows that I'm afraid of him. Recently, in one of his long-winded one-side conversations with a different cashier, he said he often runs out of his medication at the end of the month. As I'm writing this, it's the middle of February. If this is how he's acting on his meds, I'm afraid of what the end of the month will bring. This incident took place last Friday, and it's still on my assistant's mind, and honestly, I can't blame her. I've been thinking about it a lot too. We have a client who we assigned to one of our more experienced caregivers, since it was clear early on that she required more assistance than most. She's a lovely woman, though, a talented pianist with an interesting past. One of my favorite stories she shares is about hitching a ride across the country to see Jimi Hendrix perform live in California. But she has a kind of anxiety that can be difficult to manage. The kind that results in 4-hour-long phone calls filled with panic, sobs, and screams, because she wasn't sure when she could get soap. In the last month alone, the fire department and police have had to visit her about 9 times. It's not because she's fallen or hurt herself. It's simply because she needed reassurance. As you can imagine, the apartment management wasn't thrilled with this, but the client flat out refuses to even consider assisted living. So sirens it is. Because of this, my assistant and I have been keeping a close eye on her through the detailed reports our caregiver writes at the end of each shift. We noticed her mental state seemed to be declining. I started to worry about Alzheimer's. One report mentioned that the client had been complaining about a blind man living with her in the apartment. She was distressed, claiming she didn't agree to share her living space. I remember thinking, this is it. It's getting worse. Last Friday, my assistant was covering for the caregiver, who was out of town. I was already at home on call when I got a call from my assistant. Hey, sorry to bother you, but I have a question if you have a minute. Sure, go ahead, I said. I'm at the client's place. She buzzed me in, but when I knocked on the door, no one answered. It's locked, and it's completely silent. What do you want me to do? That hit me hard. I was convinced she'd fallen. Every time I'd visited and knocked on the door, she'd freak out and scream through it, telling me to just hold on for a moment. Okay, go find the landlord and see if maintenance can get you in. She might have fallen. The main office is empty, but I'll try to find someone. All right, call me back with an update. If you don't find them, we might have to call 911, just to be safe. I hope she had just fallen asleep or was too anxious to make it to the door. Anything but a fall. About an hour later, my assistant called back. It was a fall. She had been found in the bathroom, pantsless, covered in dry, hard feces. When my assistant found the client, she was in a delirious state, unable to recognize where she was or who she was. The paramedics were called immediately. Based on the condition she was in and the age of the feces, they determined she had been lying there for several days. They told my assistant that if she hadn't been found, the client would have passed away the next day. My assistant offered to clean up the mess herself. The bathroom was covered in waste, but apartment management had people coming in to handle it. I can't recall the details of that part, but what sticks with me is what my assistant said she did next. The client was confused and kept asking how she'd been buzzed in. To buzz someone in, you need to answer a connected phone and press 0, but there were no phones near the client. My assistant said she listened to the phone ring for about 15 to 30 seconds before she was buzzed in. But how did that happen? I asked if the management had let her up, as sometimes they'll ring us in out of sympathy. But no, they weren't even in the building at the time. She told me they were just walking in as I was on the elevator on the first floor, looking for them. My assistant found all 3 phones lined up on an end table in the client's living room, next to her favorite chair. I figured it must have just been a glitch in the system. My assistant believes it was fate or some higher power that led her in that day. We've talked about it every day since then. She said she hasn't been able to stop thinking about it and still can't figure out how she managed to get in, despite her own beliefs. Personally, I don't think about it much anymore. What matters is that the client is recovering, and for that, I'm thankful. And that's where the story ends. She's alive. For the past 22 years, I have convinced myself that a disturbing series of events never actually took place. I've managed to tell myself it was all just a figment of my imagination. Our minds and souls possess an incredible ability to shield us from trauma, and I certainly used that to my advantage. But then, I reconnected with a friend I hadn't seen in years, the same friend I supposedly went through this experience with. He confirmed that everything I thought was made up was, in fact, real. I'll do my best to recount the entire story as it happened, in all its raw detail. And apparently, it truly happened. This story centers around a Ouija board. I can barely bring myself to say those words, let alone write them. I haven't touched one since 1997, and I never plan to again. That was 22 years ago, which means I was just 13 at the time. That age when you start to explore the world beyond childhood curiosity. No longer is it just about sleepovers, video games, or high school sports. Girls were beginning to catch my attention. And in my time, professional wrestling was gaining massive popularity. A group of friends and I had started diving into horror movies and scary stories. This was something that always intrigued me. I had been hooked on scary stories since I was around 8. After reading scary stories to tell in the dark, those books were a staple at our scholastic book fairs. Looking back, those stories and illustrations were far too intense for an 8-year-old. But I loved them. There's something thrilling about being scared. We enjoy the adrenaline that breaks up the monotony of everyday life. My friend Philly and I loved getting together to watch horror films and swap urban legends. We did this almost every week, especially during the summer when school was out. This was, of course, before the internet era, so our only options for media were renting movies or going to the theater. And since most horror movies were rated R, we couldn't see them. For millennials and post-millennials, this might sound like a nightmare scarier than any of the real-life horrors we were imagining. We got bored of renting the same old films, so we began focusing on urban legends, what would now be called creepypastas. We found books at the library with these legends or just made up our own. At that time, we craved something more intense, something that would truly terrify us. I wish we had just stuck to telling our silly, scary stories. Every group of friends likely has one of those Parker Brothers board games tucked away somewhere, the infamous Ouija board. This toy, as it was marketed, is pretty simple. They even used to advertise it. It's a board with the alphabet, numbers, yes, no, and goodbye. I suppose it was inevitable. Every kid has to learn for themselves that these things shouldn't be messed with, both literally and figuratively. I grew up in a religious family, and I knew deep down that something about this board didn't feel right. I could see through the marketing gimmick. They were targeting children like me, not adults. You played Monopoly and Chutes and Ladders with your parents. But the Ouija, that was something for kids to play alone. I felt this was wrong, but I also didn't know anything. I was 13. My current 35-year-old self has a hard time understanding what happened and why I dove into this knowing the outcome would not be ideal. I found it, my buddy Philly said, under my sister's bed. This was the start of a series of events that would haunt me for quite a while. It, of course, was the board. We made sure no one was home when we pulled it out. There was an air of mischief around this thing. Certainly, we couldn't deal with his sister finding us in her room, and definitely not his mom finding out what we were up to. The board was glossy and new. It looked like we were possibly the first to use it. The device that 2 or more people used to glide over the board, revealing the answers to your questions, was almost ivory. I wanted to research what this was called, but I don't even want to start down the rabbit hole online. If you've noticed, I don't even want to call it by its name, simply referring to it as the board. I'll call the gliding thing the oracle for this story. We had 2 sessions with the board. The first was incident-free. We asked a few silly questions, what our future held, if we would get married and have kids, stuff like that. Even though I had never played this before, I still knew not to ask questions like what was the name of the person that we were talking to. Maybe we had gotten that from the hours of watching scary movies. The second session was when things got weird. Philly and I were going back and forth with the board, asking some simple questions about our future lives. I remember asking where I would live as an adult, and the board said, Seattle. I lived 2,000 miles away from Seattle at the time, but this is where I felt the aura of the board shifted. It felt like a thunderstorm was brewing, one where the sky turned red. The oracle we used to piece out our answers to our dumb questions had moved slowly before. Now it was jerking, almost moving off the board to the next letter. I can tell you this about this game, it is real and neither one of us were moving the oracle. My hands weren't even on it at some points. But back to the Seattle question, I was and still am a huge baseball fan. I have rooted, unfortunately, for the Detroit Tigers for my entire life. The mid to late 90s was the explosion of Ken Griffey Jr. to Major League Baseball. I loved watching him play. I got his jerseys for a couple Christmases and birthdays. I'm sure most know that Griffey played for the Seattle Mariners. I loved how that nautical S looked on that teal uniform. I started researching the city of Seattle and thought how cool it would be to live there. Do you know where this is going? This board was not plastic and glue to me anymore. There was something controlling it. something powerful and dark that knew I had this particular city on my mind at this time. I didn't let on to my buddy what I was feeling. He didn't seem to let on that he was afraid either. So we kept on. The next segment of questions is a blur to me. All I remember is the oracle going mostly to no when we asked a question, even if it wasn't a yes or no answer that was required. Then I asked the last question that I would ever ask the Ouija. Don't get your hopes up. It was nothing profound or deep at all. This is what I asked: would the Detroit Tigers ever win another World Series? The oracle moved so fast to goodbye. I thought a tiny trail of fire would be on the board. I'll never forget looking at Philly and seeing what I'm sure was the exact same bulging eyes, mouth open expression that I had on my face. We knew that one of the rules of this game was when the board said goodbye, you put it away immediately. I think we even read that on the instructions. We threw the board into its box, hustled to his sister's room as fast as two Hostess cupcake and Mountain Dew-filled teenagers could. Philly chucked the board under her bed like nothing happened. After a few breathless moments, we finally started to let out tiny little laughs, lighting up into belly laughs as we hit the floor rolling. We were laughing out the nervousness, also kind of feeling dumb at how scared we got. After the madness finally started dying down, we moved on like nothing happened. I should have stated right from the start that it was late at night when we started playing. I would say it was about midnight, as cliché as that is. When the board said goodbye to us, it couldn't have been more than 1 a.m. in the morning. Philly lived in the country. Across the street was a cemetery. I know, now I'm really hitting cliché territory, but I swear it's true. There weren't many houses around. If you wanted to walk to your next door neighbor, you better plan for a good 20-minute hike. Finally, all mania was shed, and tired from playing video games, we decided to step outside. We looked at the graveyard, noting how calm the night was. Philly had a large section of his yard covered with rose bushes. They were pretty wild and were not kept up. Needless to say, nothing would be able to get into those bushes and not get completely diced. We heard rustling. Again, the night was calm and I don't remember any wind at all. At first, we could just hear the bushes, then movement. To this day, I do not know and don't care to know what it was. Could have been a small animal, but I highly doubt it. We knew something wasn't right and bolted for his house. Even writing this, I can feel an eerie presence. We both knew this was related to the board. Philly suggested we make it a night and try to get some sleep. I wish that was the end of this story. A few short hours later, we were woken up to a series of faint knocking noises. I could not determine where they were coming from, but it sounded like it was somewhere outside his house. We both cautiously got up and moved to the kitchen where his front door was and saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A man, slight build, wearing all denim, was standing right outside the door. The man also had creepy-looking horn-rimmed glasses on, outdated even for the late 90s. Philly had a porch in the front that was raised about 5 steps from the ground, and the man was on the ground. So when we saw him, we were actually looking slightly down at him, seeing him from the top of his head down. It is an image that has burned into my mind. He didn't move. He just stood there. We once again fled to his room and shut the door. We didn't call the police or his mom. We just sat in his room, not sure what to do. After a few moments, we stupidly decided to see if he was still there. He was gone. I successfully convinced myself that there was no man on the side of the house. I just couldn't handle what was happening on this night. Philly did the same. Finally, day broke and we dismissed the disturbing events of the previous night. I don't even think we discussed what happened. About a week later, I got a call from Philly. He said he had a dream that we were playing the board and a hand came out and attempted to pull his head down. He awoke sweating and in a small amount of pain from where the force had grabbed him. I hated to say that I had a similar dream. Right there, we decided to meet up and do something about this board. My mom dropped me off at his house a few days later to sleep over for the night. When I got to his house, I couldn't find Philly anywhere. This was before cell phones, so I had no way to just call him up and ask where he was. I decided to check behind the house near his garage. There, standing next to a pile of kindling in a burning barrel, was Philly with the Ouija board sitting on top. The mischievous grin on his face told me exactly what he was planning. We set that thing on fire, but nothing happened. I was freaking out at that point. We'd all heard the stories about people trying to burn a Ouija board without success. But Philly, he wasn't bothered in the slightest. We grabbed a jerry can full of gasoline and drenched the board. The flames took over and the board disappeared into thin air, turning to ash. It was done. As far as I can recall, nothing else happened that night. We didn't speak about it again. In the years that followed, I convinced myself it was just a product of an overactive teenage imagination. I might have mentioned it to a few people here and there, mostly just to tell a scary story. But I treated it as if it never really happened. In my mind, it was all made up. We did play the game, but the rustling bushes, the man, none of that ever occurred. As time went on, I moved far away from Philly. We kept in touch occasionally, maybe seeing each other every couple of years, with me even driving almost 1,000 miles to visit him about 10 years ago. Fast forward another 10 years, and I decided to make one last trip to visit my hometown and catch up with Philly. He invited some local friends, and we had a huge bonfire. Between bites of pizza and swigs of beer, I started recounting the story from that night. I told him how I had convinced myself that everything after using that board was just my imagination. I know this sounds crazy, but I thought I saw a man standing outside your house that night, I said. Philly looked at me with a dead serious expression and replied, "Yeah, I remember that." My blood turned cold. He confirmed everything, exactly what happened that night. Felt like we were back there, reliving it 22 years ago. I had repressed that memory so deeply that I truly convinced myself it had never happened. But now, hearing him say it out loud, I realized the truth. The Ouija board is not something to be trifled with. I haven't touched or even looked at one in over 2 decades. How something as simple as a piece of cardboard can open a door to another realm, I don't know. All I can say for sure is that you should never, ever mess with it. Have you ever had the eerie sensation that someone's watching you? Or worse, have you ever seen someone and had no idea they were actually a spirit? This story began when I was 11 and spanned several years, all the way until I was 20 or 21. It wasn't a constant thing, but I think my apartment acted like a magnet for energy, drawing in multiple spirits. I lived right across from a graveyard, so it wasn't exactly surprising when I started seeing things as a kid. My first vivid memory happened when I was 11. Life was decent at the time, but a lot of trauma had occurred in the years before, making me vulnerable and more open to these experiences as I desperately tried to escape my reality. What I didn't realize at the time was that the spirits or entities around me wouldn't hesitate to make their presence known. Some seemed tied to the violent events I had witnessed or had heard about, even involving murder. At that age, I didn't really consider them as anything other than vivid dreams. But now, looking back, I know they were something else entirely. Anyway, the first memory that stands out to me was when my mom's boyfriend stayed the night. I felt safe with him there, and I didn't want to be alone in my room. I had always been scared of this one corner of the room, the spot you'd turn to face my bed. I couldn't explain why, but I always felt like someone was watching me from there during the night. This particular night, I decided to sleep in the living room instead. My mom's boyfriend offered to watch TV with me, and he ended up falling asleep too. I remember waking up to the sound of his loud snoring, and I thought, well, here we go. It was really dark. The hallway outside was even darker. My living room was right next to my room, but I had to turn the corner to face where I was sleeping. And this is when things took a turn. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I was watching that corner, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to face my fear. You know how people tell you to be brave and just close your eyes when you're scared at that age? Well, I couldn't do that. I just couldn't. Then, out of nowhere, these extremely pale green fingers began to curl around the corner of the door frame. I can still feel the chills just thinking about it. The fingers were unnaturally long, stretching all the way across the door frame. They had this baggy, cloak-like appearance, like burlap attached to them. It was bizarre and terrifying. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. That was the end of that encounter. The next experience happened a few years later, and I remember it like it was just yesterday. It's a chilling memory to think back on. I had these awful dreams that night, and I woke up to a scream echoing in the middle of the night. My eyes shot open, and I was frozen, remembering the nightmare just moments after waking. I started to feel cold sweats from the fear. In the dream, there was this white humanoid creature crouched in my closet. It was terrifying, and it had the most sinister smile, like it had malicious intentions. As I recalled the dream, it felt as though I was reliving it all over again. I was paralyzed by fear, and all I could do was cry. Tears kept falling until I finally pulled the blankets over my head. I fell back asleep like that, thinking, screw it. By this point, I was in high school dealing with depression. I was the only openly gay guy in the whole school, and things were not going well. I had my art to help me express my emotions, though, and I hadn't had any paranormal experiences or night terrors for a while. Then, one day after school, I remember feeling completely overwhelmed. I was being bullied, and I felt so alone. I went to my room, feeling like there was nowhere to turn. I started crying, but it wasn't out of sadness. It was tears of frustration, of feeling isolated and empty. I was kneeling by my closet after letting the tears fall when I heard a soft woman's voice ask, "Are you all right?" It was gentle and breathy. I replied quietly, not wanting anyone to hear and think I was crazy, but there's no mistaking it. I definitely heard a voice coming from the closet that day. Fast forward to when I was around 20, the age when I really got into the club scene. I started performing in nightlife and diving deeper into my art. I loved costumes and makeup, so I embraced drag and became a gay clown, a drag queen. Trust me, this all connects. One night, I was practicing my makeup for a gig, putting on eyelashes and getting ready for a competition. My mom was always a huge supporter, always excited to see my work once I finished. As I was doing my makeup, I saw my mom walk past my room, heading toward the living room. It was just her profile that I could see, but something about the way she looked that night seemed off. She was wearing a white nightgown, the kind with that floral lace tie pattern around the collar, and it brushed the floor. My mom has black hair, and I didn't think much of it at first because I was just focused on myself, feeling excited about showing her my progress. I jumped up, eager to get her opinion, and started walking out of my room. "Hey Mom, what do you think?" But before I could finish my sentence, I noticed that the living room was completely empty, and it was dark except for a single light. That definitely shook me. I've never been so shocked before. I figured maybe my mom had just quickly gone to her room. So I went to check on her, thinking I'd show her my work. When I walked into her room, expecting her to be awake since the light was on, I found her fast asleep in bed, wearing her Winnie the Pooh pajamas, not the nightgown. I woke her up right away. "Were you just in the living room?" I asked. She had obviously been sleeping. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Seeing something like that, something so real, just like a person walking past my room, and not questioning it at the time, it was unsettling. Whatever these things are, they're clever and know when it's safe to reveal themselves. I haven't seen that woman since, but there's no doubt in my mind it wasn't my mom. And honestly, I hope the apartment was haunted and not me. Before I tell you what happened, let me give you a quick rundown of the layout of my house. I live in England, and my bedroom is on the second floor, right next to my parents' room. When you step out of my room, the stairs leading to the landing and hallway are directly in front of you. On the first floor, there are 4 rooms, but the 2 that matter for this story are the kitchen and living room, which are next to each other. At the far end of our kitchen, there's a door that leads into a few more rooms, which I think were originally intended to be part of a self-contained flat or apartment. One of these rooms has a door that leads out to the back garden, which is a small, fenced-in wooded area. My bedroom window faces the garden. Now, as I'm typing this, it just happened about 15 minutes ago. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. when I heard my cat knocking something over in my room and then climbing out of my window. I definitely saw something outside. I had left the curtains open, and the window was slightly ajar. I was pretty annoyed because our cat is usually a house cat and isn't allowed out at night. I went over to the window to call him back inside, but I couldn't see him anywhere. I figured he might have jumped down onto the patio, which is just below the window. It's a bit of a drop, but I couldn't see him on the patio either. At this point, I thought it was the only place he could have gone. So, I quickly threw on a jumper and slippers, grabbed my phone with the flashlight on, and headed to the kitchen. When I got to the room that leads to the back garden, I closed the door to the kitchen behind me. I walked to the back door, opened it, and shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. I left the door open and stepped outside a few paces to see if I could spot my cat. Remember, in order to get back into the house, you'd have to cross right in front of my line of sight. After a few moments with no sign of him, I decided the best course of action was to wake my parents and let them know what was going on. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and then locked the kitchen door as well. I walked into the living room, planning to figure out how to explain to my parents that my cat had decided to go out the window at 2 a.m. But when I turned on the light, I saw my cat sitting on the sofa. I'm sure I saw something leave my room, but if it wasn't my cat, then what was it? I don't fly anymore. I used to, quite a lot, actually. My job required me to travel across the country, attending meetings to pitch investment opportunities to wealthy hedge fund managers. It was a great job, honestly. The pay was way more than I deserved. But now I work from home and drive everywhere. And I mean everywhere. I live in New York City, but my parents retired in Florida. And yeah, I drive down there to visit them about 3 times a year. It's a long drive, but I'd rather do that, even if it means getting food poisoning from some questionable roadside tacos, than fly. And here's why. It all started with a regular flight from LaGuardia to Houston, a typical business trip to meet with oil-rich investors in Texas. I was seated in a window spot in business class. The takeoff was just like any other. Everything was smooth, nothing out of the ordinary. I was flipping through the in-flight magazine and scrolling through the drinks menu, just passing time. I had woken up at 5:30 to catch the flight, and I'm not really a morning person. So, as soon as I could, I closed the window shade, leaned back, and tried to get some rest before the afternoon meeting. Right as I was about to drift off, I heard a loud pop. In my groggy state, I thought it might have been someone popping open a champagne bottle, one of those suits celebrating with a glass of bubbly at breakfast. But when I looked around, there was no bottle, no attendant with an ice bucket, nothing. That's when a terrifying thought crossed my mind. I slid the window open to check on the plane's left wing engine, trying to push the panic out of my head. I told myself everything was fine, that it was probably nothing. After all, nothing had ever happened on a flight before, even though I'd occasionally gotten those weird flashes of fear. But it wasn't fine. The popping sound was exactly what I had dreaded. There was smoke, thick, dark vapor pouring from the engine, trailing behind us as we flew. I quickly grabbed the nearest attendant and pointed out the window without saying a word, not wanting to cause a scene. When the flight attendant saw what I had pointed out, she went pale and rushed up the aisle toward the cockpit. Within moments, others started to notice what was happening, and panic quickly spread through the plane. Cries of alarm filled the air as more and more passengers realized the danger we were in. People rushed to the left side of the plane, crowding the windows and screaming. Meanwhile, the flight attendants were doing their best to stay calm and keep the passengers calm too. Just before the situation reached a breaking point, the captain's voice came over the intercom. That's when I had what was probably the strangest, most surreal experience of my life. Watching people losing their minds while the captain sounded completely unfazed, almost bored. I guess that's the level of composure they're trained to have. The captain told everyone to remain calm, return to their seats, and assured us the plane would be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport, which, by that time, was in Virginia. We ended up landing safely, and the only real inconvenience was that I had to reschedule the investment meeting. But for a moment, I truly thought we were all going to burn up in an explosion when the engine failed, and we'd be plummeting to the ground at what felt like 500 miles per hour. That was by far the scariest experience I've ever had. Despite trying to get over it, I've never been able to get back on a plane since. Like I said, now I drive everywhere. And while it's a hassle, it beats the cold sweats and panic attacks I get just thinking about sitting on a runway, waiting for the engines to catch fire.